The stagecoach lurched to a violent halt, the iron rims of its wheels grinding against the hard-packed earth of Main Street with a sound like a shriek. Dust, thick and tasting of alkali and horse sweat, billowed up in a choking cloud, coating the wooden boardwalks of Larkspur, Wyoming territory. It was late autumn in the year 1887, and the wind that swept down from the northern peaks carried the distinct, metallic scent of coming snow. Josie Hart stepped down from the coach, her boot finding purchase on the uneven ground. She coughed, bringing a gloved hand to her mouth to stifle the spasm, and looked around. The town was a collection of raw lumber and false fronts huddled against the vastness of the plains. Beyond the buildings, the prairie stretched out in an endless sweep of brown grass and gray sage, rolling toward a horizon that seemed terrifyingly distant. The sky was a pale, hard blue, so wide it made her feel small, exposed, and utterly insignificant. She reached back to take her carpetbag from the driver. The leather was worn thin at the corners, much like her patience, and it contained everything she owned in the world: 2 changes of clothes, a heavy wool shawl, a sewing kit with the needles she had sharpened until they were mere slivers of steel, and a letter. The letter burned a hole in her pocket. It was from Jamie, her younger brother back in Kansas. She could still see his jagged, desperate handwriting in her mind. He was begging her to send for him before winter fully set in, before their landlord threw him out onto the streets where the freeze would take him. Jamie was soft-hearted and had a bad lung. He would not survive a winter rough sleeping. Josie tightened her grip on the carpetbag. She had $7.40 in her purse. It was not enough to bring Jamie west. It was barely enough to keep her fed for a week. She adjusted her hat, smoothing back a stray lock of chestnut hair, and stepped onto the boardwalk. She needed work. She was not afraid of labor. She had scrubbed floors, mended heavy canvas, and cooked for 20 men at a time. She was a survivor. Her first stop was the Larkspur Mercantile. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully, a stark contrast to the silence that fell over the 2 women browsing the fabric bolts when Josie entered. She walked to the counter, keeping her head high. "I am looking for employment," she told the proprietor. "A man with a mustache that drooped over his mouth. I can stock shelves, keep your ledger, or sweep out. I am a fast worker." The man looked at her, his eyes sliding over her travel-stained dress, the darkness of the circles under her eyes, and the way she held herself, too bold for a lady, too weary for a young girl. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "We heard you were coming," he said. "The stage driver talked while he watered the team. Said you sang at the Gilded Cage down in Cheyenne. Said your name is Hart. My name is Mrs. Hart," Josie corrected, her voice steady though her pulse jumped. "And I worked as a seamstress," the proprietor sneered. "A seamstress who married a card sharp. We are a decent establishment, ma'am. We do not need your kind of trouble here. My wife would not stand for it." The rejection stung, but Josie did not flinch. She turned and walked out, the bell chiming its mockery behind her. It was the same at the boarding house. The landlady, a formidable woman with arms like hams, blocked the doorway, wiping her hands on a stained apron. "Full up," the woman grunted. "I see a sign in the window that says vacancy," Josie pointed out. "Full up for saloon girls," the woman spat. "Judge Ellsworth warned us about drift, said to watch out for women bringing vice into Larkspur. We know about the man you killed." "I did not kill anyone," Josie said, her voice rising in frustration. "My husband died in a fight." I was nowhere near it. The door slammed in her face, the latch clicking with finality. Josie stood on the porch, the wind whipping her skirts around her legs. The rumor mill had outpaced the stagecoach. They said her husband, a charming but vicious gambler named Silas Hart, had been murdered, and that she had been the lure that drew him to his death. The truth was far more pathetic and far more painful. Silas had died because he cheated a man who was faster with a bottle than Silas was with a derringer. But the truth did not matter in a town like this. Reputation was the only currency, and hers was counterfeit. She tried the small schoolhouse at the edge of town, hoping they might need someone to light the fires or sweep the floors. A churchwoman was sweeping the steps as Josie approached. The woman stopped, leaning on her broom, her eyes narrowing. "You are the Heart Woman," she stated flatly. "I am looking for honest work," Josie said. "I can sew, I can clean." The woman scoffed. "The judge told the parson to keep an eye out. He said you are dangerous. He said you were involved in card scams, and worse. We do not want your influence near our children. Move along before I call the sheriff." Humiliated, cold, and close to broke, Josie wandered back toward the center of town. The wind was picking up, biting through her thin coat. She felt the heavy weight of failure settling in her chest. If she could not find work, she could not save Jamie. It was that simple, and that terrifying. She found herself near the sheriff's office. She didn't intend to go in, but the wind was fierce, and she stepped into the recessed doorway just to escape the biting chill for a moment. The door was slightly ajar, propped open by a heavy boot scraper, and voices drifted out. Stern, male voices. "I am telling you, Caleb, it is not natural," a deep, resonant voice said. That was Judge Ellsworth. Josie had not met him, but she knew the tone of a man who believed his word was law. A man alone cannot raise a girl like that, especially not one with her background. The law looks more kindly on placing children with proper families. "That girl is my blood," a second voice answered. This voice was lower, rougher, like gravel shifting under a boot heel. It vibrated with suppressed anger. "She is my brother's daughter. She is half Mexican." "Thorn," a third voice interjected, smooth, oily. That was Silas McGraw. Josie had heard the name. He was the biggest cattle baron in the territory. A man who owned half the valley and wanted the other half. "And she needs a mother. My wife is willing to take her in. We would straighten her out, teach her her place." Josie pressed herself against the rough wood of the building, holding her breath. "You will not touch her," the rough voice, Caleb Thorne, growled. The judge sighed, the sound of papers shuffling. "Caleb, be reasonable. I have a duty to the welfare of that child. You are a bachelor living on a ranch 20 miles from nowhere. You are out on the range for days at a time. It is unsuitable, unless your domestic situation changes, and I mean implies a wife of good reputation. I intend to revisit the guardianship arrangement at the start of the year." "The start of the year," Caleb repeated. "That is 2 months. Winter is coming. Caleb." The judge's voice was final. "It is a hard time for a child to be without a mother. Find a proper wife, or I will find that girl a proper home." Heavy footsteps approached the door. Josie scrambled back, pretending to examine a wanted poster nailed to the wall. The door swung open, and Caleb Thorne stepped out. Josie looked up, and for a moment, her breath caught in her throat. He was a mountain of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat that had seen better years. Dust and frost clung to the wool. His hat was pulled low, but she could see his face clearly. It was a hard face, weathered by sun and wind, with lines etched deep around a mouth that looked like it rarely smiled. His eyes were the color of flint, cold and sharp. He looked like a man carved from the very granite of the Rockies. He stood on the boardwalk, pulling on a pair of leather gloves, his jaw working as he stared down the street. He looked furious, but it was a contained fury, a pressure building behind a dam. Behind him, in the doorway, the judge appeared. He adjusted his spectacles and looked past Caleb, his eyes landing on Josie. He curled his lip in distaste. "And you," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the wind, "do not think you can linger here. Mrs. Hart, we have vagrancy laws in Larkspur. If you have no employment and no residence, the sheriff will escort you to the county line by sundown tomorrow." Caleb turned, his flinty eyes following the judge's gaze. He looked at Josie. He saw a woman in a dress that had been turned and patched 3 times, shivering in the cutting wind. He saw the worn carpetbag at her feet. He saw the way she lifted her chin, refusing to look down despite the judge's scorn. The boarding house landlady, who had been sweeping her porch across the street, shouted over, "Don't you worry, Judge. I already told that saloon woman there is no room for her here." Caleb looked from the landlady to the judge, and then back to Josie. His expression did not change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He stepped off the boardwalk into the dust of the street, heading toward the livery stable. Josie watched him go. Desperation clawed at her throat. She had until sundown tomorrow. She had no money, no prospects, and the most powerful man in town had just marked her as unwanted. But she had heard the conversation in that office. She knew what Caleb Thorne needed. She picked up her bag and ran after him. "Mr. Thorne," she called out, her voice snatched by the wind. "Mr. Thorne, wait!" Caleb stopped near the water trough outside the livery. He turned slowly, his hand resting near the colt on his hip, not threateningly, but out of habit. He looked down at her. He was a head taller than she was, and he loomed over her like a thunderhead. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice was just as rough as it had been in the office, but there was a tiredness in it now. Josie caught her breath. The wind whipped strands of hair across her face, and she pushed them back impatiently. She saw the way he looked at her, not with the lecherous hunger of the men at the gilded cage, and not with the scorn of the church woman. He looked at her with a detached assessment, like she was a horse he was considering buying but suspected might be lame. "I heard," she said, rushing the words. "I was outside the door. I heard what the judge said about your niece." Caleb's eyes went flat and dangerous. "You make a habit of eavesdropping, Mrs. Hart." "I make a habit of surviving," she countered. "I need a job. Mr. Thorne, I can cook. I can keep a house cleaner than anyone in this town. I can sew. I can make clothes for the girl. I can keep accounts. I know how to stretch $1 until it screams." Caleb stared at her. He looked at her hands, clenched around the handle of her bag. He saw the calluses on her fingers, the small scars from needle pricks. He saw the redness of her knuckles from the cold. "I don't need a housekeeper," he said. "You need a home," Josie said, her voice trembling slightly. "You need to show that judge that the child is well cared for." Caleb let out a short, harsh breath that might have been a laugh. "A housekeeper is not what the judge is asking for. You heard him? He wants a wife." He turned to walk away. Josie took a step after him. "I will work for cheap. Whatever you can pay. Please, I need the money." Caleb paused. He looked over his shoulder at the main street. He saw Silas McGraw stepping out of the saloon, laughing with two of his hands. He saw the judge walking toward the courthouse, tipping his hat to the ladies who had shunned Josie. He saw the smirks on the faces of the men loitering on the boardwalk as they watched Josie beg. He looked back at her. He saw the desperation in her eyes. Yes, but he also saw a fire there. She was terrified, but she was standing her ground. "Where are you staying?" he asked. I am not yet," she admitted. "The boarding house is full." "Full," Caleb repeated dryly. "Right." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar. He flipped it toward her. She caught it instinctively, the cold metal biting into her palm. "Get something to eat," he said. "Go to the livery loft. The hostler owes me a favor. Tell him I sent you. It is out of the wind." "But the job," Josie started. "I will think on it," Caleb said. He walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the livery stable, leaving Josie standing in the street with a single dollar in her hand and the wind howling around her skirts. That night, the wind picked up a howl that rattled the window pane of Caleb's rented room above the saloon. The noise from below, the tinny piano, the shout of laughter, the thud of boots filtered up through the floorboards. A familiar, grating rhythm. Caleb sat at the small, scarred table, a bottle of whiskey uncorked but untouched beside him. Spread out before him were papers, his brother's will, written in a shaky hand just days before the fever took him, and the letter from Judge Ellsworth, delivered this morning, its elegant script masking a brutal threat, concern regarding the moral environment, unsuitable for a female child of her temperament. Caleb rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the scratch of stubble. He thought of Annie. She was 7 years old, with eyes as dark as her mother's, and a spirit that was already being crushed by the weight of her grief. She was alone at the ranch right now, watched over by an aging cook in a bunkhouse full of rough hands who didn't know what to do with a grieving child. If McGraw got her, he would destroy her. He would treat her like a servant in his own house. Or worse, he would beat the heritage out of her. Caleb knew men like McGraw. He knew men like the judge. They saw the world in straight lines and boxes, and they cut off anything that didn't fit. Caleb looked at his own hands. They were big, scarred, capable of breaking horses and building fences, capable of violence when the need arose. But were they capable of raising a girl alone? The judge was right about one thing. The ranch was a hard place. He leaned back, the chair creaking. He thought of his own youth. His father had been a drunk who used his fists to solve every problem. Caleb had learned to fight before he learned to read. He had spent 10 years punching his way through every saloon from Texas to Montana before he scraped together enough money to buy the land in Larkspur. He had built the Thorn Ranch with blood and sweat, battling drought, blizzards, and rustlers. He had built it for his brother, to give him a safe place, and he had failed. His brother was dead. His sister-in-law was dead. Annie was all that was left. He would not lose her. His mind drifted to the woman in the street. Josie Hart, the saloon woman, the gambler's wife. He had seen the way she stood against the wind. He had seen the way the town looked at her, like she was trash to be swept away. She was desperate. She was broke, and she had a reputation that was already ruined. A plan began to form in his mind. It was cold. It was dangerous, and it was likely insane. But Caleb Thorne was a man who played the hand he was dealt, no matter how bad the cards were. He picked up the whiskey bottle, poured a shot, and knocked it back. The burn felt like clarity. The next morning dawned pale and bitter. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, and the air smelled of sage and impending snow. Caleb found Josie sitting on the back stoop of the livery stable. She was shivering, wrapped in her thin shawl. Her fingers were red and numb as she clumsily pushed a needle through the hem of her dress. She was trying to look presentable, trying to mend the fraying edge of her dignity. She looked up when his shadow fell over her. She scrambled to her feet, tucking the needle into her sewing kit. "Mr. Thorne," she said. Her voice was husky from the cold. Caleb looked at her. In the harsh morning light, she looked even more fragile. Her eyes were shadowed, her skin pale, but she met his gaze without flinching. "Walk with me," he said. He led her away from the stable, out toward the edge of town where the buildings gave way to the open prairie. The wind tore at their clothes. He stopped near a split-rail fence that marked the end of Larkspur and the beginning of the wilderness. He turned to face her. He did not waste time with pleasantries. "You need money," he said. "You need protection from the law and from the debts your husband left behind." Josie stiffened. "You know about the debts?" "I made inquiries last night," Caleb said. "A man came through on the stage a week ago asking about Silas Hart, a collector. He will be back, and when he comes, he will look for you." Josie's face went white. She gripped her shawl tighter. I can work. I can pay it off. Not with housekeeper's wages," Caleb said, "and not in this town. No one will hire you. Mrs. Hart, you are marked. By sundown. The sheriff will put you on a wagon south, and the collector will find you in Cheyenne." Josie looked away, staring out at the bleak, brown hills. Her shoulders slumped. He was right. She was trapped. "I have a proposition for you," Caleb said. Josie looked back at him. What kind of proposition? Pretend to be my wife. The words hung in the cold air between them. Josie stared at him, her mouth opening slightly. "Excuse me? You heard me," Caleb said, his voice flat and businesslike. "The judge wants me to have a wife. He wants Annie to have a mother. If I do not provide one, he takes the girl. So, I am hiring you for the job." "Hiring me?" Josie whispered. "We will go to the courthouse today," Caleb continued, pacing out the terms as if he were negotiating a cattle sale. "We will get a license. We will marry. You will move out to the ranch. You will wear my ring. You will take my name. To the town, to the judge, and to the church. You will be Mrs. Caleb Thorne. You will keep my house. You will care for Annie, and you will act the part of a respectable lady." "And in return?" Josie asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. Caleb looked her in the eye. "You get a roof over your head, a warm bed, food. The law cannot touch you if you are my wife. I have lawyers who can handle your husband's debts, and I will set aside money in your name, $500. After 1 year, if we have convinced the judge and the guardianship is secure, you can take the money and go. You can bring your brother west, or you can start over somewhere else. $500. It was a fortune. It was enough to save Jamie. It was enough to buy a small house, to open a dress shop. It was freedom. But Josie remembered the gilded cage. She remembered men who bought women with promises of safety. She remembered her husband, Silas, telling her to be nice to a wealthy stranger because they needed the money. What else? She asked, her voice trembling. What are the other duties? Caleb's expression hardened. He took a step closer, towering over her. There is one condition, he said, and it is absolute. He held up a finger. This is a business arrangement. Nothing more. It stays pretend. There will be no real marriage between us, no touching beyond what is needed to look convincing in public. You sleep in your room, I sleep in mine. Josie blinked, surprised. I have no use for a wife, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low, icy register. And I certainly have no use for love or desire. Desire ruins judgment. It makes men weak. It ends in graves. I buried my brother because he let his heart rule his head. I will not make the same mistake. He stared at her, his eyes intense and unyielding. Do we understand each other? No feelings, no tangles. You do your job. You help me keep my niece, and in a year, you leave. Josie looked at him. She remembered the night in the Kansas brothel, the smell of stale beer and cheap perfume. Silas gripping her arm, whispering that the man just wanted to talk. The terror when the door locked. She remembered the vase she had smashed over the man's head. The blood, the running. She looked at Caleb Thorne. He was hard, he was cold. He was offering her a lie, but he was offering her safety. And he was offering her a line she did not have to cross. He did not want her body. He wanted her performance. She felt a shiver run through her, part relief, part estranged, sharp hurt at his dismissal. He looked at her and saw a tool. Nothing more, but tools survived. She thought of Jamie, coughing in a cold room in Kansas. She lifted her chin. She looked Caleb Thorne in the eye. 1 year, she said, $500. And safety for my brother when I send for him. Caleb nodded once. Done. He held out his hand. It was large, the leather glove worn smooth. Josie hesitated for only a second. She reached out and took his hand. His grip was firm, dry, and devoid of any warmth. Let's go, he said. The courthouse opens in 10 minutes. The ceremony was brief, dry, and joyless. Judge Ellsworth presided, his face a mask of suspicion and distaste. He looked from Caleb to Josie, his pen hovering over the license. This is sudden. Caleb, the judge said, I told you I would make arrangements. Caleb replied, his voice steady. Mrs. Hart and I, we came to an understanding. She needs a home. I need a wife. It is practical. The judge sniffed. Practical. And I suppose you expect me to believe this is a union of suitable moral character? You said you wanted a wife of good reputation. Caleb said, Josie, Mrs. Thorne, is ready to leave her past behind. She is ready to be a mother to Annie. Unless you would prefer to explain to the county why you are keeping a child from a legally married couple. The judge glared, but he signed the paper. He stamped it with a heavy thud that echoed in the quiet office. Very well, the judge said. But I will be watching. Caleb, if I see one sign of instability, one sign that this woman is bringing her habits into that child's life, I will remove the girl. Do not test me. I wouldn't dream of it, Caleb said. He turned to Josie. He did not smile. He did not offer a word of comfort. He simply extended his arm. Mrs. Thorne, he said. Josie placed her hand on his forearm. Through the thick wool of his coat, his arm felt like iron. She looked down at the plain gold band he had purchased from the mercantile 10 minutes prior. It felt heavy on her finger. A shackle or a shield. She wasn't sure which yet. She looked up at him. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the door. He was a stranger. She knew nothing about him except that he loved his niece enough to shackle himself to a woman he despised, and that he was afraid of desire. "Ready?" he asked, not looking at her. "Yes," she whispered. They walked out of the courthouse together, Mr. and Mrs. Thorne, stepping into the pale, blinding winter sun. The wind tore at them, but they walked side by side. Strangers bound by a lie, strangers bound by survival, heading toward a wagon that would take them into the vast, empty heart of the Wyoming wilderness. The wagon wheels groaned against the hard-packed earth, a rhythmic protest that seemed to be the only sound in the entire world. They had left Larkspur behind hours ago, the town reducing to a smudge of wood smoke and gray lumber against the horizon. And now there was nothing but the Wyoming territory stretching out in every direction. The road was little more than a pair of rutted scars cutting through the open grassland, winding through sagebrush that looked like huddled, frozen ghosts and toward the dark, jagged silhouettes of distant buttes. The sky was a hard, relentless blue, the kind that offered no warmth, only a vast and terrifying clarity. The air bit at any exposed skin, sharp and dry, carrying the metallic scent of iron and coming snow. Caleb Thorne sat on the buckboard bench, the reins held loosely in his gloved hands. He drove with an easy, practiced competence, his body swaying slightly with the lurch of the wagon, but his shoulders remained rigid. He had not spoken a word since they passed the town limits. He stared straight ahead, his profile cut from granite, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, as if he were trying to see all the way to the end of the year he had just purchased. Josie sat beside him, huddled under a thin wool blanket she had pulled from her carpet bag. It was pitiful protection against the wind that swept down from the north, cutting through the layers of her patched dress as if they were made of gauze. Her teeth chattered, a small, clicking sound she tried desperately to suppress. She felt small, perched up there on the high seat, exposed to the scrutiny of the hawk circling overhead and the silent judgment of the man beside her. She stole a glance at him. He was a terrifying man, in his way. Not loud or brash like the men she was used to in the saloons, but intense. He contained his energy, keeping it coiled tight beneath that heavy coat. His jaw was set hard, a muscle feathering near his ear every time the wagon hit a particularly deep rut. "Is it much farther?" Josie asked. Her voice sounded thin and snatched away by the wind the moment it left her lips. Caleb did not look at her. 20 miles to the way station," he said. "We will stop there for the night. The horses need rest. 20 miles. Josie did not know if she could survive 20 miles of this freezing silence. "Does it always blow like this?" She tried again. "Mostly," he said. He offered nothing else. No comfort, no conversation, no bridge across the chasm that lay between them. He was keeping his condition. He was a man fulfilling a contract, transporting goods from one location to another. The afternoon wore on, bleeding into evening. The hard blue of the sky bruised into purple and then a deep, slate gray. Low, heavy clouds began to gather in the west, obscuring the peaks, their bellies dark with the promise of a storm. The temperature dropped with the sun. The wind changed its voice, shifting from a whistle to a howl, tearing across the open plains with a violence that shook the wagon frame. Josie could no longer stop her shivering. It started in her core and radiated out, making her limbs shake uncontrollably. Her lips felt numb and strange, and she knew they must be turning blue. She curled in on herself, tucking her chin into her chest, trying to preserve whatever heat she had left. The wagon lurched over a stone, and her shoulder bumped against Caleb's arm. He felt like a wall of solid rock. He glanced at her then, seeing the way she was shaking, the violent tremors that she couldn't hide. He pulled the horses to a momentary halt, the leather lines slapping against their rumps. "Here," he grunted. He shifted, unbuttoning the heavy buffalo hide coat he wore. For a moment, Josie thought he was taking it off, but instead, he shrugged one side of it open. "Move closer," he ordered. Josie hesitated, staring at him. "I said move closer," he snapped. his voice rough. "You are freezing. If you get sick, you are no use to Annie." The practical cruelty of the words stung, but the cold was a sharper enemy. Josie slid across the wooden bench. Caleb draped the heavy side of his coat over her shoulders, effectively tenting her against his side. The warmth was immediate and shocking. He was like a furnace. She felt the solid heat of his ribs against her arm, the heavy weight of the hide blocking the wind. It was an awkward, forced intimacy. She could smell him now: leather, horsehair, the sharp scent of pine soap, and the underlying musk of a man who worked hard. She sat stiffly at first, afraid to lean too much of her weight against him, afraid of breaking the invisible barrier he had erected. But as the wagon started moving again, the exhaustion and the cold wore her down. Her head drooped, and her shoulder came to rest against his chest. Caleb stiffened for a second, his breath hitching, but he did not push her away. He kept the reins in one hand and kept his other arm braced near her, creating a pocket of shelter. Confusing warmth spread through Josie, and it wasn't just from the coat. It was the feeling of being shielded. For years, men had only touched her to take. They grabbed, they pulled, they leaned in with whiskey-sour breath and wandering hands. This man touched her only to keep her from freezing, and he seemed to resent even that. Yet, beneath the heavy wool and hide, she felt the steady, slow thump of his heart. It was a rhythm of safety, however reluctant. They rode like that for hours, a strange, two-headed silhouette moving through the gathering dark. By the time the yellow lights of the way station flickered into view, Josie was half asleep, lulled by the motion and the warmth. The station was a low, sprawling log building with a sod roof, hunkered down in a dip between two hills to escape the worst of the wind. A corral stood off to the side, horses crowding the fence with their tails turned to the gale. Caleb pulled the team up to the hitching rail. The sudden lack of motion jarred Josie awake. She sat up quickly, the cold air rushing in as the coat fell away from her. She felt a sudden, keen sense of loss. "Stay here," Caleb said, climbing down. "I will see about a room." He disappeared inside. Josie waited, rubbing her arms, watching the snow begin to fall. It came in horizontal streaks, hard little pellets of ice that pinged against the wagon wood. Caleb returned a moment later, his face grim. "Come on," he said, reaching up to help her down. His hands on her waist were impersonal, lifting her as easily as he would a sack of grain. They walked into the station. The common room was thick with smoke and the smell of roasting venison. A dozen men, teamsters, drifters, and a few soldiers, sat around rough tables, their conversation dying down as Josie entered. She kept her eyes on the floor, feeling the familiar weight of their stares. The innkeeper, a bustling woman with flour on her apron and a face round as a moon, came out from the back, wiping her hands. "Mr. Thorne," she boomed, her voice cheerful. "And this must be the new Mrs. Thorne. Word travels fast on the wire." She beamed at Josie, looking her up and down with unabashed curiosity. Josie forced a smile, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. "Pleasure, ma'am," Josie murmured. The woman winked, a shy one. "Well, that is how it should be. Now, like I told your husband, we are packed to the rafters tonight. The storm drove everyone in off the trail." She leaned over the counter, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I put you in the back room. It is small, but it is private. I figured you would not want to be separated on your, well, let us call it a special trip." Josie froze. She looked at Caleb. His jaw was clenched so hard she thought a tooth might crack. "Mrs. Gable," Caleb said, his voice tight. "My wife can take the room. I can sleep in the stable loft." The innkeeper laughed, a loud, cackling sound. "Don't be a fool. Caleb Thorne, the loft is full of drovers, and it is 10 degrees below freezing out there. Besides, the ladies' bunkhouse is crammed full. I've got a family of 6 moving to Oregon in there. There is literally nowhere else to put her. Or you." She slapped a heavy iron key onto the counter. "Take the room. It has a bed. You are married. For heaven's sake, stop acting like a pair of nervous colts." Caleb stared at the key. The condition he had set, the absolute separation, was slamming headfirst into the reality of the frontier. He looked at Josie. She was swaying on her feet, her face pale with exhaustion. She looked like a strong gust of wind would knock her over. He snatched the key from the counter. "Fine," he ground out. "We will take it." The room was hardly a room at all. It was a partitioned corner of the attic, the walls made of thin pine planks that let in every draft and every sound from the common room below. It contained a washstand with a cracked pitcher, a single chair, and a narrow rope bed piled with quilts. Caleb walked in first, dropping his saddlebags in the corner. He filled the small space, his head nearly brushing the rafters. Josie followed, closing the door and leaning against it. The lock clicked with a sound that felt terribly final. Caleb did not look at her. He immediately began unrolling his bedroll, spreading the canvas and blankets out on the rough wooden floorboards. "Mr. Thorne," Josie said. Caleb kept working, smoothing out the blanket with aggressive snaps of his wrist. "You do not have to sleep on the floor," she said. "I said I would keep my condition." Caleb said, not looking up. "The floor is fine." "It is freezing," Josie argued. The wind was already whistling through the chinking in the logs. "I have slept on harder ground in colder weather," he said. "Take the bed, Josie. Go to sleep." He blew out the lantern, plunging the room into darkness save for the gray, ghostly light filtering through the small window. Josie stood in the dark for a moment. She could hear the rustle of him settling onto the floor, the heavy sigh of his breath. She fumbled her way to the bed, sitting on the edge. She kept her dress on, merely loosening her boots. She pulled the quilts up to her chin, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The sounds of the inn settled, boots dropping, low murmurs, the occasional snore, but the wind outside did not settle. It grew worse. An hour passed, then 2. The temperature in the room plummeted. The window pane rattled as sleet struck it like thrown gravel. The draft coming through the floorboards was icy. Josie was shivering again, despite the quilts, but it was the sound from the floor that worried her. Caleb was shifting constantly, the canvas of his bedroll crinkling. She heard a low curse, then the sound of him blowing on his hands. "Mr. Thorne," she whispered into the dark. Silence. Then a grunt. "What? You are going to freeze to death down there. I am fine. You are not fine. Your teeth are chattering." Josie sat up, wrapping the quilt around her shoulders. "Please," she said, her voice cutting through the dark. "This is ridiculous. The bed is narrow, but we can fit. I promise I will stay on my side. I trust you." The silence that followed was long and heavy. Josie held her breath. She was inviting a man into her bed, a strange man. Memories of other rooms, other men who forced their way in, pricked at the back of her mind. But this was different. Caleb had established his wall. She was simply offering him a way to survive the night without freezing. Finally, she heard the rustle of him standing up. The floorboards creaked under his weight. "Just for warmth," he muttered, his voice rough with cold. "Yes," she said, "just for warmth." He did not get under the covers. Instead, he lay down on top of the quilts, fully clothed, his boots still on. He lay on the very edge of the mattress, his back to her, leaving a careful, deliberate foot of space between them. The mattress dipped under his weight, tilting Josie slightly toward him. She resisted gravity, holding herself stiffly on her own edge. They lay there in the dark, side by side, inches apart. The storm raged outside, shaking the shutters, but the room felt intensely, painfully quiet. Josie could hear his breathing, slow, controlled, deep. "It is strange, isn't it?" Josie whispered. The words slipped out before she could stop them. "What is?" Caleb asked. "Being here, being us." She heard him shift. "It is what it is. A contract." Josie turned her head on the pillow. She could just make out the dark shape of his broad shoulders. "My husband," she said softly, testing the weight of the truth. He used to charm rooms like that one downstairs. He could walk in and have every man buying him a drink and every woman smiling within 10 minutes. He was like sunlight. She paused. But sunlight burns if you stand in it too long. When the doors closed, when the money ran out, he was not charming. He was a creature of sharp edges. She felt Caleb go still. The town, she continued, her voice trembling. They whispered that I was part of his games, that I lured men in. But the truth was, I was just part of the scenery, a prop. And when I stopped being useful, she stopped, the memory of the night in Kansas choking her. He tried to sell you, Caleb said. It wasn't a question. Josie closed her eyes. Yes, he owed money. He told me it was just for an hour, just to clear the debt. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was filled with a heavy, somber understanding. I did not kill him, she whispered, but I did not cry when he died. Caleb lay still for a long time. The wind howled, a lonely, desolate sound. My brother, Daniel, Caleb said finally. His voice was low, a rumble in his chest that Josie could feel through the mattress. He was the best of us, soft-handed. He liked books. He liked music. He met Maria in Santa Fe. She was beautiful, proud. He took a breath. When he brought her to Larkspur, the town turned its back. Judge Ellsworth, Silas McGraw. They squeezed us, cut fences, poisoned water holes. But Daniel wouldn't leave. He said the land was ours. Josie listened, her heart aching for the pain in his voice. 3 years ago, Caleb said, the words coming harder now. There was a stampede, a thunderstorm. They said, but cattle don't run like that from thunder. Not that herd. Someone fired shots. Someone drove them into the canyon. McGraw? Josie asked. I can't prove it, Caleb said bitterly. But I know. Daniel and Maria were in the canyon, trying to turn the leaders. They were crushed. He shifted, the quilt rustling. I was in town, Caleb whispered. I was drinking. I should have been there. If I had been there. You can't know that, Josie said gently. I promised to look after them, he said. And now all I have is Annie, and the same men who killed her parents are trying to take her because her skin is brown and her uncle is a failure. You are not a failure. Caleb, I'm a man who keeps losing the people he is supposed to protect. The raw honesty of the moment hung in the cold air. Fragile and new. They were two broken people, lying in the dark, comparing their scars. Suddenly, a violent gust of wind slammed against the house. The latch on the shutter gave way with a crack, and the wooden shutter banged open against the outside wall. Icy air blasted into the room, swirling with snow. The lantern on the table rattled. Josie gasped as the cold hit her. Damn it, Caleb swore. He started to sit up to go fix it, but as he moved, another gust hit, shaking the very frame of the bed. Josie flinched, instinctively curling into a ball. Without thinking, Caleb reached for her. It was a reflex, a protective instinct honed by years of shielding things from the harshness of the plains. He pulled her toward him, wrapping his arm around her shoulders and tucking her head against his chest to shield her from the draft. Josie froze, then melted. For the first time in her life, she felt held without a demand attached to it. He wasn't grabbing her to use her. He was holding her to keep the cold away. She pressed her cheek against his shirt. The flannel was rough, but beneath it, he was warm, so incredibly warm. The smell of him, tobacco, leather, and clean sweat wrapped around her like a drug. Heat flooded her chest, followed by a low, heavy ache in her belly that surprised and scared her. She hadn't realized how starved she was for touch until this moment. Caleb felt her shaking ease. He felt the soft curve of her body against his rigid side, the way she fit into the hollow of his shoulder as if she had been carved to rest there. His heart thudded against his ribs, harder with every breath she took. He looked down. Her face was tilted up toward his in the dark. Her eyes were wide, catching the faint, ghostly light from the snowy window. He should push her away. He should get up and fix the shutter. He should remember his condition, but his condition was trembling on the edge of breaking. "Josie," he breathed. She didn't answer. She just looked at him, her lips slightly parted, his self-control, built brick by brick over years of hardship, faltered. He lowered his head. The kiss was slow at first, hesitant, a question. He brushed his lips against hers, testing the reality of it. Her lips were soft, cool from the air, but warming instantly under his touch. Josie let out a small, broken sound, a whimper of need, and pressed closer. Her hands came up, clutching at the front of his shirt, gripping the fabric as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. That small sound shattered him. Caleb groaned low in his throat and deepened the kiss. It wasn't polite anymore. It was hungry. It was the taste of forbidden water in a desert. He angled his head, his mouth capturing hers with a fierce intensity. He tasted the salt of her skin and the sweetness of her breath. Josie opened to him, meeting his hunger with her own. This wasn't the transaction of a saloon or the coercion of a marriage bed. This was raw, honest desire. It was loneliness recognizing loneliness. She felt wanted, not as a thing, but as a woman. Tears stung her eyes, hot and sudden. She tangled her fingers in his hair, pulling him closer. Their bodies pressed together through the heavy quilts, the friction creating a spark that threatened to burn the whole station down. Caleb shifted, his leg moving over hers, his weight settling against her. Solid and real. For a moment, there was no past, no future, no conditions. There was just the fire between them. Then, reality struck Caleb like a bucket of ice water. He was losing control. He was doing exactly what he swore he wouldn't do. He was letting desire cloud his judgment. He was touching her. He jerked back as if he had been burned. He rolled away, scrambling to the edge of the bed, his chest heaving. He sat up, his back to her, scrubbing a hand over his face. "No," he muttered, his voice ragged. "No." Josie lay still, her lips tingling, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. She felt the sudden absence of his warmth like a physical blow. Josie started, her voice shaking. "I am sorry." Caleb cut her off. The words were harsh, strained. "That was a mistake. I forgot myself. It won't happen again." He stood up abruptly, stalking to the window to wrestle the shutter closed. He slammed the latch home with unnecessary force. Josie pulled the quilt up to her nose, hiding her face. She felt cherished and rejected all at once. A confusing storm of emotions that left her raw. "Go to sleep, Mrs. Thorne," Caleb said from the darkness. He sat back down on the floor, wrapping himself in his own coat. He did not come back to the bed. The next morning, the world was glazed in ice. The sagebrush outside the station was bowed under the weight of frost, glittering like cruel diamonds in the pale, weak sunlight. Caleb was up before dawn. When Josie woke, he was already gone from the room. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons, the memory of the kiss burning on her lips. She found him by the wagon, harnessing the team. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. His eyes were shadowed, his face set in grim lines. "Good morning," Josie said tentatively. Caleb didn't look at her. "Morning. We need to make time. The drifts are deep past the ridge." He was a wall again, the tender warmth of the night. The man who had held her and kissed her with such desperation was locked away behind shuttered eyes. He spoke only of the horses, the road, and the weather. The journey to the ranch was a long, silent slog through the snow. Josie sat beside him, the physical distance between them on the bench feeling vast and unbridgeable. She watched his hands on the reins, strong, capable hands that had tangled in her hair just hours ago, and felt a hollow ache in her chest. They reached the Thorne Ranch in the late afternoon. It sat in a wide valley, a sprawling collection of log buildings and corrals standing alone against a backdrop of rolling, snow-dusted hills. It was beautiful, in a stark, lonely way. Smoke curled from the chimney of the main house, a large two-story structure with a wraparound porch. The wind was sharper here, cutting down from the high country, and the silence was deeper, heavier. "This is it," Caleb said, pulling the wagon to a halt in the yard. A dog barked, and the front door of the house opened. A little girl stepped out. She was small, with skin the color of warm honey and dark, heavy braids that hung to her waist. She wore a simple calico dress and a wool shawl that looked too big for her. She clutched a worn and rag doll to her chest, her dark eyes wide and wary. "Annie," Caleb said, his voice softening for the first time that day. He climbed down and walked to the porch. The girl didn't run to him. She stood still, watching him with a solemnity that belonged to an adult, not a child. "I brought someone," Caleb said. Josie climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff. She walked toward the porch, conscious of the eyes on her. Not just Annie's, but the eyes of the ranch hands who had paused their work to watch. One of the hands, a grizzled man leaning on a shovel near the barn, spat into the snow. "Looks like he brought a white woman for the half-breed," he muttered. It was quiet, but Josie heard it. She saw Annie flinch, her small shoulders hunching as if anticipating a blow. Something fierce and hot ignited in Josie's chest. She knew that look. She knew what it felt like to be the thing that didn't fit, the thing people spat at. She walked straight up the steps. She didn't look at Caleb. She looked at Annie. She knelt down on the cold planks of the porch, disregarding the mud on her skirt, until she was eye level with the girl. "Hello, Annie?" Josie said softly. Annie stared at her, clutching the doll tighter. "I am Josie," she said. "I am your uncle's wife, but I would like it very much if you called me Aunt Josie." She smiled. It wasn't a polite, social smile. It was a genuine, warm expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "I like your doll," Josie added. "Does she have a name?" Annie hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Sarah? Sarah is a lovely name." Josie said, "I have a sewing kit in my bag. Maybe later, if you like. We could make Sarah a new dress. I have some blue ribbon." Annie's eyes widened slightly. Blue, bright blue, like the summer sky. A small, hesitant smile touched Annie's lips. "Okay." Caleb watched them, a lump forming in his throat. He saw the way Josie looked at the girl, not with judgment, not with pity, but with recognition. He saw the way she had ignored the slur from the hand, focusing entirely on making the child feel safe. He felt a pang of guilt over his coldness that morning, followed by a surge of the fear that had made him cold in the first place. She was too good at this. She was making it real. "Come inside," Caleb said, his voice gruff. "It is freezing." That night, the house was quiet. The wind prowled around the eaves, testing the windows, but the thick log walls held the heat. Caleb led Josie up the stairs to the second floor. He stopped at a heavy oak door. "This is your room," he said. He pointed to the door directly across the hall. "That is mine." Josie looked from one door to the other. 6 feet of hallway separated them. It wasn't far, but it felt like a canyon. "It is a nice room," Caleb said awkwardly. "The bed is good. Thank you," Josie said. She looked at him, searching his face for a sign of the man from the way station. But he was closed off, his expression guarded. "Sleep well, Mrs. Thorne," he said. "Good night, Caleb," she replied. He went into his room and closed the door. Josie heard the heavy slide of the bolt. She went into her own room, closing the door behind her. She leaned against the wood, listening to the silence of the house. She was safe. She had a roof. She had a job. But as she touched her fingers to her lips, feeling the phantom pressure of his mouth, the distance between their doors felt heavier than any locked gate. She was Mrs. Thorne in name, but in this house surrounded by the endless, unforgiving land, she had never felt more alone. Winter descended on the Wyoming territory not as a guest, but as a conqueror. It did not creep in. It slammed the door shut on autumn and bolted it tight. By December, the world outside the heavy log walls of the Thorne Ranch house was a monochrome study in white and gray. Snow crusted the fields in hard. Wind sculpted drifts that resembled frozen waves. And the sky was a low, impenetrable lid of steel that seemed to press down on the very earth. The wind was the only thing that moved, a ceaseless, hunting thing that carried a fine, icy dust capable of finding every microscopic crack in the chinking to chill the air inside. Life on the ranch contracted. It became a rhythm of survival, measured in wood chopped, ice broken on the creek, and livestock counted. Inside the house, Josie Hart declared her own quiet war against the bleakness. She threw herself into the domestic duties with a fervor that bordered on desperation. The austere, masculine house that Caleb had built, a place of function over comfort, slowly began to soften under her hands. She found a trunk of old linens in the attic and spent her evenings by the fire, cutting and hemming them into curtains to block the drafts. She mended shirts that the ranch hands had long given up on, weaving her needle through the heavy flannel with the precision of a surgeon. She took stock of the pantry, which was grimly stocked with flour, lard, and dried beans, and managed to coax loaves of bread from the wood stove that actually rose, filling the kitchen with a scent that smelled like life itself. The kitchen became her command center. In the evenings, while the wind shrieked around the eaves, the stove's belly glowed a comforting orange. It was here that she drew Annie out of her shell. One Tuesday evening, while the snow piled up against the window panes, Josie sat in the rocker with a basket of scraps. Annie sat on a stool at her feet, watching Josie's hands with dark, intense eyes. "Hold the needle like this," Josie said gently, guiding the girl's small fingers. "You have to be firm with the fabric. Annie, if you are timid, the stitch will not hold." Annie bit her lip, concentrating hard as she pushed the needle through the scrap of linen. They were making a dress for her doll, Sarah. It was simple work, but to Annie, it seemed like magic. "Like this?" Annie asked, her voice small. "Perfect," Josie said, smiling. "You have a natural hand for it. Your mother must have been clever with her hands, too." Annie went still. "Uncle Caleb says she could ride a horse better than any man," she whispered. "But he never talks about her sewing. He remembers her strength," Josie said, smoothing the girl's hair. "That is how men grieve. But I bet she made things beautiful, too." Annie looked down at the doll. "Aunt Josie," she asked. "Yes, sweet pea. Are you going to leave?" The question hung in the warm air, heavy and sharp. Josie stopped rocking. She looked down at the child, seeing the fear that lay naked in her eyes. It was the fear of a child who had learned that people were temporary. "Why would you ask that?" Josie asked, keeping her voice steady. "Because the others did." Annie said, "Mrs. Gable sent a lady to clean once. She stayed 3 days. She said the quiet was too loud, and the one before that. She said Uncle Caleb was too hard." Josie felt a stab of fierce protectiveness in her chest. She set the sewing basket down and reached out, cupping Annie's chin to make the girl look at her. "I am not those ladies," Josie said firmly. "And I am not going anywhere, I promise you. Annie, I will stay right here as long as I am allowed to be here. As long as I am allowed." The qualification tasted like ash in her mouth. She had a contract. 1 year, but looking into Annie's hopeful eyes, Josie pushed the thought away. 1 year was a lifetime to a 7-year-old. The ranch hands were a harder audience to win over. They were rough men, shaped by hard seasons and bad whiskey, and they viewed the sudden appearance of a wife with deep suspicion. When Josie entered the dining hall to serve the evening stew, conversation would die instantly, replaced by the scraping of spoons and the shuffling of boots. She knew what they were thinking. Rumors traveled on the wind in Wyoming. They knew she had come from a saloon town. They knew Caleb had brought her back like a piece of livestock he had purchased at an auction. Some muttered that the boss must have been truly desperate to marry a saloon girl, while others just watched her with eyes that stripped her bare. And then there was Caleb. He came in late every night, long after the sun had surrendered to the dark. He would stomp the snow from his boots on the porch, the sound like gunshots in the quiet house, and enter with the cold clinging to him like a second skin. His face would be raw from the wind, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. Josie would hand him a bowl of stew and a chunk of bread. He would nod, a sharp, jerky motion, and mutter a thanks that barely cleared his throat. He ate quickly, standing up or sitting at the edge of the table, as if he couldn't afford to get comfortable. He kept the conversation minimal. Orders for the next day, reports on the herd. He treated her with a polite, rigid distance, as if he were afraid that a single moment of warmth might crack the wall he had frantically rebuilt since that night at the way station. He slept behind his locked door, and the silence between their rooms was loud enough to keep Josie awake for hours. In mid-January, the supplies ran low, the coffee tin was empty, and the flour barrel was scraping bottom. Caleb announced at breakfast that he was taking the wagon into Larkspur and that Josie should come to select the dry goods she needed. The journey into town was a grim mirror of their arrival months before. The air was frigid, the sky a brilliant, blinding blue that offered no heat. Caleb drove with his usual stoic silence, though he did ensure Josie had a buffalo robe tucked around her legs. Larkspur in winter was a huddled collection of smoking chimneys and gray slush. When they walked into the mercantile, the bell chimed, and the warmth of the pot-belly stove rushed to meet them. The store was crowded. Several women from the church league were gathered by the ribbon counter, and 2 ranchers were arguing over the price of barbed wire near the back. The conversation faltered when Josie and Caleb walked in. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. Caleb ignored them, walking straight to the hardware counter. Josie took a breath, straightened her spine, and went to the fabric section. Annie needed a new winter coat. The one she had was threadbare at the elbows. She found a bolt of sturdy, dark blue wool. It was thick and warm. She carried it to the counter where the clerk's wife, Mrs. Miller, stood with her arms crossed. "I would like 3 yards of this. Please," Josie said politely. "And 2 spools of blue thread, Mrs." Miller looked at the wool, then at Josie. She didn't move to cut it. "That is the imported wool, Mrs." Miller said. "It is very dear. $2 a yard. I have the money," Josie said, placing the coins Caleb had given her on the counter. "Mrs." Miller sniffed. She reached under the counter and pulled out a bolt of rough, gray shoddy, the kind used for horse blankets or the poorest of coats. "This would be better suited for your needs, Mrs." Miller said, dropping the heavy bolt on the counter with a thud. "It is durable and cheap. You should save the good calico and wool for decent folks who know the value of quality." The insult was not subtle. It was a slap. Josie felt the heat rise in her cheeks. "I did not ask for the gray," Josie said, her voice low. "I asked for the blue. It is for a child, Mrs." Miller smiled, a thin, pinched expression. "Ah, yes, the child. Well, perhaps the gray is fitting. Then, considering what?" Josie asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Mrs." Miller leaned in. "Considering her nature, we wouldn't want her getting airs above her station, would we? Mixed blood and all." Josie's hands clenched into fists on the counter. She was about to retort, to tell this woman exactly where she could put her gray wool, when she heard a whisper from the ribbon counter behind her. Desperate. Truly. Imagine marrying that kind of woman just to keep a house. And the poor girl, doubly cursed now. First the mother she had, and now an aunt who was a gambler's whore. "It is a house of sin out there on the range." The words sliced through Josie like a skinning knife. It wasn't just the insult to her. It was the casual cruelty toward Annie. Doubly cursed. She felt suddenly small, dirty, and exposed. The fragility of her position, the wife who wasn't a wife, the woman playing dress-up in a respectable life, crumbled. She abandoned the fabric on the counter and turned, walking blindly toward the door. She needed air. She stepped out onto the boardwalk, gasping in the freezing air. The wind dried the moisture in her eyes before it could fall as tears. She hugged herself, staring at the muddy street. "Well, look at what the cat dragged in." The voice was slurred and wet. Josie looked up. A cowboy was leaning against the post of the saloon porch next door. He was young, but ruined by drink, his face slack and his eyes swimming. She recognized him vaguely. He had been one of the men who leered at her when she first arrived in town. "Mrs. Thorne," he sneered, dragging the name out. Mighty fancy coat for a girl who used to sing for nickels. Josie turned to walk away, heading toward the wagon. "Where's the boss?" the man called out, stumbling off the porch to follow her. He leave you out here to cool off? Or is he done with you already? Josie stopped. She turned to face him. Go sleep it off, she said coldly. The man laughed. He stepped closer. Invading her space, he smelled of rot gut whiskey and unwashed skin. You know, the boys were taking bets, he said, lowering his voice, wondering if Caleb gets to sample the goods, or if he just bought you to warm the bed. That is what you are, ain't it? Caleb's new bed warm. Just a cheap... The slap cracked through the cold air like a pistol shot. It was instinct. Josie didn't think. She just moved. Her hand connected with his cheek with every ounce of frustration, shame, and anger she had suppressed for 3 months. The man's head snapped back. He stumbled, blinking. Then, his expression shifted from shock to ugly rage. "You bitch!" he snarled. He lunged for her, his hand raising to strike. Josie flinched, bracing for the blow. It never landed. A black blur slammed into the man from the side. Caleb hit him with the force of a runaway train. He seized the cowboy by the collar of his duster and hurled him backward. The man flew 5 feet and slammed into the wooden support post of the saloon with a bone-shaking thud. Before the man could slide down, Caleb had him pinned, his forearm crushing against the man's windpipe. Caleb's face was terrifying. It was devoid of color, his eyes black holes of fury. He held the man there, choking him, lifting him until his boots scrabbled against the boardwalk. "Caleb!" Josie screamed. Caleb didn't look at her. He leaned in close to the man's purpled face. "You listen to me," he hissed. His voice was low, lethal, a sound that made the hairs on Josie's arms stand up. "If you ever speak my wife's name again, I will cut your tongue out. Do you understand me?" The man gagged, clawing uselessly at Caleb's arm. He nodded frantically. Caleb held him for a second longer, letting the terror sink in, then dropped him. The man crumbled to the boardwalk, coughing and retching. Caleb stepped back, adjusting his cuffs. He looked around. A crowd had gathered. He met their gazes. Mrs. Miller in the doorway, the sheriff across the street, the loiterers. "Anyone else have something to say to Mrs. Thorne?" he asked. Silence. Caleb turned to Josie. His eyes were still wild, his chest heaving. He reached out and took her elbow. His grip was hard, possessive. "Get in the wagon," he said. The word wife echoed in Josie's head as she climbed up. My wife. It hit her like a physical touch, a shield that had protected her from the blow, but also a brutal reminder of the lie. He had claimed her, fought for her, but it was all part of the performance. The ride home was suffocating. The tension in the wagon crackled in the frigid air. Caleb drove fast, pushing the horses. "Thank you," Josie said finally, staring at the horse's ears. For what you did." Caleb's jaw worked, a muscle feathered in his cheek. "I did not do it for you," he said. His voice was tight. Josie looked at him, stung. "I did it because I had to," he continued, staring straight ahead. "If I let men talk to you like that, I look weak. If I look weak, McGraw moves in. If I look like I cannot control my own house, the judge takes Annie." He snapped the reins. It was necessary to keep up appearances. Do not read into it. The dismissal was absolute. It slapped her harder than the drunk ever could have. Josie turned her collar up against the wind and looked out at the frozen plain, feeling the cold settle deep into her bones. That night, the weather turned. It started with a drop in pressure that made Josie's ears pop. Then the wind shifted, coming from the north with a scream that sounded like a dying animal. The blizzard rolled in over the hills, a wall of white that swallowed the world whole. By 8 o'clock, the snow was piling against the door. The wind shook the house, rattling the heavy timbers. Suddenly, the front door burst open, not from the wind, but from the foreman. Gus. He was covered in snow, looking like a yeti. "Boss!" Gus yelled over the roar of the storm. "The south barn door blew the hinges. The roof is lifting. The heifers are exposed." Caleb was on his feet instantly. He grabbed his heavy coat and his hat. "Get the lanterns," he ordered. He looked at Josie. "Stay inside. Keep the fire built up. Do not open this door for anyone but us." He vanished into the whiteout with Gus. Josie paced. She added logs to the fire until the hearth roared, but the house felt cold. She went to the window, but there was nothing to see, just a swirling, chaotic void of white. Time stretched. An hour. 2. She remembered stories of men who got turned around in blizzards 10 yards from their own front door and froze to death. She remembered that Caleb was the only thing standing between Annie and the orphanage. She remembered the way his arm had felt around her neck at the way station. "Please," she whispered to the empty room. "Please come back." Just after midnight, the latch clicked. The door shoved open. Fighting the drift that had built up against it, Caleb staggered in. He looked like a corpse. His coat was frozen stiff, caked in ice. His face was gray-white, his eyebrows and beard frosted over. He stumbled, catching himself on the doorframe. Josie didn't think about his coldness in the wagon. She didn't think about the contract. Her practical instincts took over. She rushed to him. "Caleb!" She grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the kitchen where the stove was hottest. He was shivering violently, the uncontrollable tremors of deep hypothermia. "Sit," she commanded, pushing him onto the bench. He sank down, his teeth chattering so hard he couldn't speak. He held his right hand cradled against his chest. Blood was dripping from the glove, staining the floor. Josie gasped. "Let me see." She worked frantically. She stripped off his frozen coat, the heavy wool thudding to the floor. She pulled off his hat. She knelt between his legs and began to peel the glove off his injured hand. It was a jagged cut across the palm, likely from a rusty nail or a splintered beam. It was bleeding sluggishly because of the cold. "I have to clean this," she said. "It is going to sting." She fetched a bowl of hot water and a clean rag. She washed the wound, her hands firm but gentle. Caleb hissed through his teeth, his head falling back against the wall, eyes closed. Once it was clean. She bound it tight with a strip of white linen. She could feel the heat returning to his body, radiating off him in waves as he thawed. She finished the knot and looked up. His eyes were open. He was watching her. They were close. Josie was still kneeling between his knees, her hands resting on his forearm. His shirt sleeve was rolled up, exposing the pale skin of his inner arm, the dark hair, the veins standing out. The kitchen was quiet. Save for the crackle of the stove and the howl of the wind outside, it felt like a small, private world. Caleb let out a long, shaky breath. "Thank you," he murmured. His voice was rough, stripped of its usual armor. Josie looked at his bandaged hand. "You were out there a long time." "We saved them," he said. "Got the roof shored up." He looked at her hands, which were still resting on his arm. "He didn't pull away. My mother used to do this," he said softly, staring at the ceiling. "When I was a boy, if I got cut or scraped." She had gentle hands. He looked back down at Josie. "No one has fussed over me since she died. Not like this." Josie felt a lump in her throat. She tried to lighten the mood, to retreat to safety. "Well," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "someone has to keep you in one piece. The ranch would fall apart without you, and I am not tall enough to fix a barn roof." She looked up, expecting him to smile. He wasn't smiling. He was looking at her with an intensity that stopped her heart. There was something in his flinty eyes that looked like softness, like wonder. The air in the kitchen thickened. It became heavy, charged with the same electricity that precedes a lightning strike. Caleb lifted his uninjured hand, slowly, hesitantly. He reached out. His fingers were rough, calloused from years of labor. He touched the side of her face. He tucked a loose wisp of chestnut hair behind her ear. His fingertip trailed a path down her jawline to her neck. It was a searing touch. Josie shivered, but not from cold. Her breath hitched. The nearness of him, the smell of snow and man, the heat of his body. It made every broken part of her ache. She wanted him to keep touching her. She wanted him to never stop. "Caleb," she whispered. His thumb brushed her cheekbone. His eyes dropped to her lips. For a moment, the condition was dead. The contract was ash. There was only the man and the woman and the winter night. Then, the back door banged open. "Boss, you in here? It was Gus again." He stomped into the mudroom, shaking snow off his hat. Josie scrambled back, standing up so fast she nearly knocked over the water bowl. Caleb jerked his hand away, his face snapping shut like a trap. "In here," Caleb barked, his voice cracking. Gus walked into the kitchen, oblivious to the shattered atmosphere. He looked worried. "Sorry to bust in, boss, but Slim just rode in from the South Ridge. He says he found 30 head of McGraw's cattle mixed in with ours in the sheltered valley." Caleb stood up. The softness was gone instantly, replaced by the hard lines of the rancher. "Mixed in?" Caleb asked sharply. "Or drove in? Fences were cut." Gus said grimly. "Wire was snipped clean. Looks like they pushed them onto our grays to ride out the storm. McGraw." Caleb spat the name. "He is testing the line, using the blizzard as cover." He looked at Josie. The intimacy of the last 10 minutes was gone, swallowed by the hard reality of the range war. "I have to go," he said. "You can't go back out there," Josie protested. "Your hand. I have to go," he repeated, turning his back on her to grab his coat. "If I let him graze my land tonight, he will take the whole valley by spring." He walked out into the storm without looking back. Caleb was gone for 2 days. He rode the boundary line, moving cattle in the deep snow, repairing wire with frozen fingers, and sending a clear message to McGraw's riders that the Thorn Ranch was not open for taking. He left Josie alone with Annie in a gnawing dread. She spent the days watching the horizon, waiting for a riderless horse or a body strapped to a saddle. On the second afternoon, the weather broke. The sun came out, blindingly bright on the snow. A rider appeared on the road. Josie ran to the porch, her heart leaping. But as the figure drew closer, her hope turned to ice. It wasn't Caleb. The man rode a sleek bay mare that looked too delicate for this country. He wore a city coat with a velvet collar and a bowler hat. He rode with a casual, slouching arrogance. He pulled up to the porch and tipped his hat. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said. His voice was smooth, like oil on water. It carried a distinct city accent. "Denver, or maybe Kansas City." "Can I help you?" Josie asked, gripping the porch railing. "I believe you can," the man said. "I am looking for a Mr. Caleb Thorn, or, more specifically, Mrs. Thorn, though I believe you used to go by a different name." Josie's blood ran cold. "Who are you?" she whispered. The man smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Mr. Vance. I am a collector. I specialize in outstanding accounts." He dismounted, dropping the reins. He walked up the steps, his boots clicking on the wood. "Your late husband, Silas Hart, left a great many things undone. Mrs. Hart, or should I say, Mrs. Thorn. It is amazing how quickly one can change one's fortunes, from a boarding house in Kansas to a cattle baron's wife in Wyoming. Quite a climb." "What do you want?" Josie asked. Stepping back, "Mr." Vance leaned against the post, examining his fingernails. "There is money missing. Josie, a significant sum. The people I work for, important people, believe Silas hid it, and they believe his pretty little wife knows where it is. I don't know anything," Josie said, her voice rising. "Silas didn't have money. He died owing everyone." "Mr." Vance tisked. "That is the story. Yes, but my employer is not a patient man, and he is certainly not a forgiving one. He wants what is his." He looked around the ranch. "Nice place. Big, valuable. I imagine a man like Caleb Thorn values his reputation. He seems like the type who wants to be respectable." He looked back at Josie, his eyes hard. "I wonder what the local judge would think if he knew the truth about the new Mrs. Thorn, about the cons, the rigged games, the way you used to smile at men to get them to sit at the table. I never ran cons," Josie hissed. "Guilt by association, my dear. And I have witnesses who will say whatever I pay them to say." He stepped closer. "Here is the situation. You are going to find that money, or you are going to find me $5,000 to replace it." "$5,000? Josie gasped. "I don't have that kind of money. Your husband does." Vance said, gesturing to the ranch. "Caleb won't give you a dime. Then I suppose I will have to have a chat with Judge Ellsworth. I hear there is a custody battle. It would be a shame if the judge found out that Annie is being raised by a known grifter and a fugitive from justice." He put his hat back on. "I will be in town for a few days. At the hotel. Think about it, Josie. $5,000. Or the truth comes out. And believe me, when I tell it, it will be very ugly." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Josie trembling on the porch. The carefully balanced life she had built, the home, the trust with Annie, the fragile truce with Caleb, was teetering on the edge of a precipice. Caleb returned at sundown. He looked exhausted, his bandage gray with dirt, his face lined with fatigue. But he was alive. He walked into the kitchen, dropping his gear. "Gus said a stranger was here," Caleb said, pouring himself a cup of water. "City fellow. What did he want?" Josie stood by the stove. She felt sick. She could still hear Vance's threats echoing in her ears. The judge, the custody battle. If she told Caleb, he would know the depth of the danger she brought. He would know she was a liability. He might send her away to protect Annie, but if she didn't tell him, Josie started, her voice shaking. Caleb turned, sensing her fear. "What is it? Did he threaten you?" "He said he was a debt collector," Josie whispered. "Connected to Silas." Caleb's eyes darkened. "I thought we handled the debts. I paid the lawyers." "This isn't a legal debt," Josie said, wrapping her arms around herself. "It is. Gambling money. He says Silas stole it from a powerful man. He says I have to pay it back." "How much?" $5,000. Caleb swore softly. He slammed the cup down on the table. "He threatened to go to the judge." Josie continued, the words tumbling out now, tangled with shame. "He said he would tell everyone that I was part of the cons, that I helped rig the games." "Were you?" Caleb asked. His voice was sharp. "Cutting." "No!" Josie cried. "I told you, I was just there." "But Vance says he has witnesses who will lie. He says he can ruin us, ruin you." Caleb looked at her. He looked at the terror in her eyes, and then he looked past her, at the drawing Annie had left on the table, a picture of the three of them. He realized then that the danger wasn't just physical. It wasn't just blizzards or range fires. It was her. Her past was a poison that had followed her here, and now it was seeping into the foundation of his home. She wasn't just a wife. She was a weapon that his enemies could use to destroy everything he had fought for. He looked at Josie, and his expression became unreadable. The softness from the blizzard night was gone, replaced by the cold calculation of a man assessing a threat. "Did he say when he would be back?" Caleb asked quietly. "He is at the hotel," Josie said, "waiting." Caleb nodded slowly. "Go to bed." "Josie, Caleb, go to bed." He turned away from her, staring out the dark window at the land he was terrified of losing. Josie watched his back for a moment, her heart breaking, knowing that the distance between them had just become an ocean. Bad news traveled faster than a prairie fire on the Wyoming plains. Within 3 days of Mr. Vance's visit to the ranch, the whispers in Larkspur had hardened into shouted accusations. The story mutated as it passed from the saloon to the mercantile to the church steps. They said Caleb Thorne's wife was not just a widow, but a partner in her late husband's swindles. They said dangerous men were riding north looking for her. They said she had blood money hidden in her sewing basket. The culmination of the gossip arrived in the form of a succinct, icy note from Judge Ellsworth, delivered by a terrified messenger boy. It did not discuss legalities or statutes. It simply stated that the judge was deeply concerned for Annie's welfare under such a roof, and that he intended to expedite the custody hearing. That night, the tension in the Thorne ranch house was thick enough to choke on. Snow tapped a relentless, erratic rhythm against the kitchen window, driven by a wind that refused to settle. Caleb stood by the stove. The judge's letter crumpled in his fist. He looked like a man who had been cornered by a pack of wolves and was looking for something to bite. "What else are you hiding?" Caleb asked. His voice was tight, a low rumble that vibrated with suppressed anger. Josie stood on the other side of the heavy oak table, her hands gripping the back of a chair until her knuckles turned white. She was tired. She was tired of the fear, tired of the shame, and tired of the silence that filled the rooms of this house. "I told you what he said," Josie replied quietly. "You told me he wants money," Caleb countered, stepping closer. "You did not tell me why he thinks you are worth $5,000. You did not tell me why the judge seems to think you are a criminal." Josie looked down at the rough wood of the table. The shame was a physical weight in her gut, heavy and cold, but carrying it alone had become impossible. "Silas used me," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook. Caleb stopped. "Used you how?" He was a cheat, Caleb, but he was not always good at it. When he needed a distraction, when he needed to keep a mark at the table. "He used me." She looked up, meeting Caleb's hard gaze. "He made me stand behind him. He made me smile at men I despised. He told me to fetch drinks, to lean over, to keep them looking at me while he dealt from the bottom of the deck. If I refused, if I didn't flirt enough, he would bruise my arm where the sleeves covered it." Caleb's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "The night he died," Josie continued, the words spilling out now like water from a broken dam. "Silas was in deep. He owed money to a man in Kansas City, a powerful man, a saloon owner who does not forgive debts. Silas didn't have the cash." She took a breath, forcing the memory to surface. "He tried to sell me. Caleb. He told the brothel keeper down the street that I would work off the debt. He tried to drag me out of our room. He said I was the only asset he had left." The kitchen went deadly silent. The only sound was the popping of the wood in the stove. "I hit him with a vase," Josie whispered, "and I ran. I ran until my lungs burned. I stood on a street corner in the rain, shivering, with no money and nowhere to go. A man stopped his carriage. He offered me $5 if I would just get in." She looked at Caleb, her eyes wide and wet. "I almost did it. I was so hungry. I almost got in, but I didn't. I walked to the stage office and used my last coin to get out of town. When I heard Silas died in a fight later that night, I thought they would blame me. I thought they would say I set him up. So I kept running until I got here." Caleb stared at her. He saw the truth in her trembling lips, in the raw honesty of her pain. He felt a surge of sympathy, a desire to cross the room and destroy the dead man who had done this to her. But then he looked at the crumpled letter in his hand. He thought of Annie, sleeping upstairs. He thought of the judge, waiting like a vulture. Sympathy would not save his ranch. "Cold calculation might. This man Vance mentioned," Caleb said, his voice hard. "The important man. He wants his money. Or he wants revenge. Both," Josie said. Caleb turned away, pacing to the window. He stared out at the dark, snow-swept yard. "Your past is a noose, Josie, and you have put it around Annie's neck. The judge will seize on this. He will say I brought a woman of ill repute into my niece's home. He won't care that you were a victim. He will only care that you are a liability." The word stung worse than a slap. Liability. Josie stiffened. Her humiliation flared into anger. "You dragged me into this," she said, her voice rising. "You are the one who needed a prop. Caleb, you walked down the street, saw a woman who looked ruined enough to be desperate, and you bought me. You didn't ask for my history because you didn't care. You just wanted someone disposable to solve your problem." Caleb spun around. "I gave you a home. I gave you protection. You gave me a cage," Josie shouted. "And you gave me a role to play. Well, I played it. I scrubbed your floors and loved your niece and pretended to be your wife." She stepped around the table, closing the distance between them. "Does any of it matter to you? Or is it all just a transaction?" Caleb looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had drawn him to her that first day. "It is survival," he said tightly. "That is all it has ever been." Josie felt tears pricking her eyes. She thought of the way station, the cold room, the warmth of his body, the kiss that had shattered her lonely world. "And that night at the way station?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. When you held me, when you kissed me like you were drowning, did that mean nothing? Caleb flinched. The memory of that night haunted him. He remembered the softness of her, the taste of her, the terrifying realization that he could want someone so much it hurt. It scared him more than McGraw, more than the judge, more than the debt collector. It was a mistake. He lashed out, his defense mechanism slamming into place. We were cold. We were tired. It was just two lonely bodies forgetting themselves in the dark. Do not make it into something it wasn't. Josie recoiled as if he had struck her. The rejection was absolute. Two lonely bodies. A mistake. She took a deep breath, fighting back the tears. She refused to let him see her cry. "Fine," she said. Her voice was brittle. It was a mistake. She turned and walked to the door. "I won't be a liability to you, Caleb. I won't let them take Annie because of me." She left the room before he could see the first tear fall. 3 days later, the weather shifted. The snow stopped. But a hard, dry wind scoured the range, turning the drifts into dirty slush and the road into a mire of frozen mud. The sky was a pale, sickly gray. Josie was near the barn, collecting eggs from the coop. When she heard horses, she stepped out, shading her eyes against the glare. Mr. Vance was back, but this time, he wasn't alone. 2 men rode with him, rough men with battered hats and coats that looked like they had been slept in for a month. They didn't look like debt collectors. They looked like hired muscle. They cut her off before she could reach the house. Vance smiled down from his horse. That same oily, terrifying smile. "Time is up, Mrs. Thorne," Vance said. "Do you have the money?" "I told you," Josie said, clutching the basket of eggs. "I don't have it. Caleb doesn't have it." Vance sighed theatrically. "That is disappointing. My employer will be very unhappy." He nodded to the men. "Maybe we can work out an alternative payment plan," one of the rough men said, leering. He swung down from his horse. He was big, with a scar running through his beard. He walked toward her. Josie backed up until she hit the rough wood of the barn wall. "Leave me alone," she warned. The man laughed. "You owe a debt, darlin'. We are just here to collect." He reached out and grabbed her arm. His grip was bruising. Josie didn't freeze. She reacted with the fury of a cornered cat. She dropped the basket, eggs shattering on the frozen ground, and kicked the man hard in the shin with her heavy work boot. The man howled, hopping on one leg, but he didn't let go. He yanked her forward, his other hand raising to strike her. "You little—" The boom of a shotgun blast tore through the air. Dirt exploded 3 feet to the man's left. The horses reared, screaming. "Let her go!" a voice roared. Caleb stood on the porch of the house. He held a double-barreled shotgun leveled at them. He wasn't wearing a coat. He looked like a demon who had just climbed out of hell. The man dropped Josie's arm and backed away, hands raised. "Easy now." "Thorne," Vance said, his horse dancing nervously. "We are just conducting business." "Get off my land," Caleb shouted. He walked down the steps, the gun never wavering. "If you touch my wife again, I will bury you in the south pasture, and I won't bother digging deep graves." His voice was low and deadly, filled with a violence that he had kept buried for years. It was the voice of the man who had punched his way through saloons, the man who knew how to kill. Vance looked at the shotgun, then at Caleb's face. He saw that Caleb wasn't bluffing. "You are making a mistake," Vance said, his smile gone. "You can't keep protecting a whore forever, Thorne." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. "The judge is going to hear all about this." Vance spat. "He will hear about her past. He will hear about the violence. You are finished in this valley." He signaled to his men. They mounted up, glaring at Caleb, and turned their horses. They rode off, disappearing over the ridge. Caleb watched them go until they were specks on the horizon. Only then did he lower the gun. He turned to Josie. She was shaking, holding her bruised arm. He walked over to her. The fury drained out of his face, leaving it pale and shocked. He reached out, wrapping his heavy arms around her, pulling her into him. He didn't care about the broken eggs or the mud. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough. "No," She whispered against his chest. "I am fine." He pulled the blanket from his own shoulders. He had grabbed it from the porch swing on his way out and wrapped it around her. His hands were gentle, trembling slightly. "I am sorry," he rasped. "I should have been here sooner. I should have—" He stopped. He wanted to tell her that the thought of them touching her made him want to burn the world down. He wanted to tell her that she mattered more than the ranch, more than his pride. But the words stuck in his throat. He was a man who had learned that loving things meant losing them. So he just held her, his chin resting on the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her fear and her resilience. Josie stood in the circle of his arms, feeling his heart hammer against her own. But even as she leaned into him, clarity washed over her. He had defended her. He had fought for her. But Vance was right. As long as she stayed, the wolves would keep coming. They would use her to get to Caleb. They would use her to take Annie. She looked at the horizon where Vance had vanished. The path was clear. That night, the wind rattled the house like a restless spirit. Caleb sat in the parlor, cleaning his shotgun by the light of a kerosene lamp. He was silent, lost in dark thoughts. Josie went to her room. She didn't undress. She pulled her carpet bag from under the bed. It contained the same things she had arrived with. 2 dresses, the sewing kit, the shawl. She packed them quietly. She sat at the small desk and pulled out a piece of paper. Her hands shook as she dipped the pen in the inkwell. "Caleb, thank you for the roof, for the food, for giving me a chance to pretend, for a little while, that I could have a different life. Vance is right. I am a weapon they will use against you. I cannot let Annie pay the price for my past. If I am gone, the judge has no excuse. Tell them I ran off. Tell them I stole from you. Tell them whatever you need to say to keep her safe. Please tell Annie I love her. Tell her she is strong, and that her mother would be proud. I wish things were different. I wish we weren't just 2 lonely bodies in the dark. Josie." She left the letter on the kitchen table, propped against the sugar bowl, before dawn, while the house was still wrapped in gray silence. Josie slipped out the back door. The cold hit her instantly, sharp and biting. She pulled her shawl tight and started walking. The road to town was a frozen, rutted scar on the land. The sky was a pale smear of gray, offering no light. Every step took her farther away from the only home she had known in years. Every step felt like she was tearing a piece of her own heart out of her chest. But she kept walking. Caleb woke to silence. It was a heavy, wrong kind of silence. He went to the kitchen to start the coffee. He saw the paper on the table immediately. He read it standing up. A cold, hollow anger filled him. It started in his stomach and spread to his fingertips. It wasn't just anger at her for leaving. It was anger at himself for driving her away. It was anger at the world that kept taking everything he dared to care about. She thought she was saving him. She thought she was doing him a favor. She was a fool. He slammed the letter down. He didn't wake Annie. He grabbed his coat and his hat and ran to the barn. He didn't bother with a saddle. He threw a bridle on the big black gelding he used for cutting cattle and swung up bareback. He rode out of the yard at a gallop. The hooves pounded over the crusted snow and frozen mud, a thunderous rhythm that matched the beating of his heart. The wind whipped his face, stinging his eyes. But he didn't blink. He scanned the road ahead. He saw her 3 miles out, a small, dark figure trudging along the edge of the road, head bowed against the wind. "Josie!" he screamed. She stopped. She turned. He pulled the horse up hard, sliding in the mud. He jumped down before the beast had fully stopped moving. He marched toward her. "What do you think you are doing?" he shouted. His breath steamed in the frigid air. Josie stood her ground, clutching her bag. "I am leaving. Caleb, I am fixing the problem. You are running away. I am saving your family," she yelled back, her voice cracking. "Vance will come back. The judge will come back. As long as I am there, Annie is in danger. You are my family," Caleb roared. The words echoed across the empty plain. Josie froze. Caleb froze. He hadn't meant to say it, but now that it was out, he couldn't take it back. He stepped closer, his chest heaving. "You don't get to decide who stays and who goes. Josie, I decide, and I say you stay." "Why?" Josie cried, tears finally spilling over, hot tracks on her cold cheeks. "Why? Caleb? Because you need a housekeeper? Because you need a prop for the judge? Because I can't do this without you," he admitted, his voice raw and broken. He reached out, grabbing her shoulders. "You say we are just pretending. You say I see you as disposable. You are wrong." "Then tell me," Josie shouted, shaking off his hands. "Tell me the truth. Do not hide behind your condition. Why did you pull away at the way station? Why do you look at me like you hate me 1 minute and want to save me the next?" "Because I am terrified," Caleb yelled. He paced a small circle in the mud, running his hands through his hair. "I am terrified. Josie, every time I have loved something, this land has killed it. My mother, Daniel, Maria, I buried them all." He stopped and looked at her. His eyes were wide, filled with a panic she had never seen in him. "When I kissed you, when I held you, I felt it again, that feeling, that if I let myself want you, really want you, the world would find a way to take you away. And it would destroy me." Josie looked at him. She saw the boy who had been beaten by his father. She saw the man who had buried his brother. She saw the fear that ruled him. "So you are letting me go now?" she whispered, "to save yourself the pain of losing me later." Caleb looked at her. He looked at the road leading to town. He looked at the vast, empty sky. He wanted to drag her back to the ranch. He wanted to lock the doors and fight the whole world for her. But the fear was a cold iron band around his chest. Vance was coming. The judge was coming. If she stayed, she would be hurt. If she stayed, he would fail her just like he failed Daniel. He stepped back. His hands dropped to his sides. "Go," he rasped. Josie stared at him. She waited for him to change his mind. She waited for him to fight his fear. He didn't. He stood there, a statue of a man, broken by his own past. "Fine," she said softly. She turned around. She didn't look back. She started walking again, her boots crunching on the frozen mud. Caleb watched her go. He watched until she was just a speck in the gray distance. He felt a crack form in his soul, wider and deeper than any that had come before. He mounted his horse and rode back to the ranch. He was colder than the wind. Josie reached Larkspur before noon. She had no money for a stagecoach ticket. She had nowhere to go. She went to the Nugget, a rough boarding house on the edge of town that catered to miners and drifters. It was a step down from the respectable places that had turned her away before, but they didn't ask questions here. She got a room the size of a closet. The walls were paper thin, and the smell of boiled cabbage and unwashed bodies permeated the wood. She got a job scrubbing floors and changing sheets. The pay was pennies. The work was backbreaking. Every day was a fight. The men who stayed there looked at her with hungry eyes. She had to barricade her door at night with a chair. She kept her sewing scissors in her pocket, her hand always gripping the handle. But the physical hardship was nothing compared to the news she heard while scrubbing the lobby floor. Rumors drifted in like dust. They said Judge Ellsworth and Silas McGraw were making their move. They said they were pressuring Caleb over grazing rights, cutting off his access to water. They said the judge was telling people that Annie would be better off in civilized hands, and darker rumors. They whispered that Caleb Thorne had murdered a rival rancher years ago. They said the law was looking into it. They said the Thorne Ranch was crumbling, that the man who ran it had turned into a ghost. Josie scrubbed the floor until her hands were raw and bleeding. She was in town. She was away. She was safe. But her heart was 20 miles out on the plain, in a house that was slowly being surrounded by wolves. Spring arrived in the Wyoming Territory, not with the gentle unfurling of flowers, but with the violence of a thaw that tore the throat out of the winter. The Chinook winds roared down from the mountains, warm and relentless, turning the deep drifts into rushing torrents of meltwater. The creeks swelled, bursting their banks and turning the frozen pastures into quagmires of sucking, black mud. For Caleb Thorne, the change in season brought no relief. It only brought harder work. The mud bogged down the wagons and threatened the hooves of the horses. The thaw revealed the damage winter had done. Miles of fencing downed by snow, shingles stripped from roofs, and the carcasses of cattle that hadn't survived the drifts. Caleb worked himself to the bone. He drove his men and himself from the first gray light of dawn until long after the stars had pinned themselves to the vast, dark sky. He spent his days in the saddle, wrestling with barbed wire that sliced his gloves, dragging bogged calves out of the mire, and riding the perimeter with a rifle scabbard under his leg. He watched the horizon constantly, his eyes squinting against the glare, looking for rustlers or the silhouette of Silas McGraw's riders. He worked to keep from thinking, if he stopped moving, the silence of the big house would crush him. Annie felt the silence, too. She had grown quieter since the day Josie left. She no longer ran to meet Caleb when he rode in. She stayed in the kitchen or near the hearth, clutching her worn doll, Sarah, with a grip that turned her knuckles white. She sensed the wrongness in the house, the jagged hole where Josie's warmth used to be, but she did not have the words to ask why her aunt had vanished. One evening, Caleb came in covered in mud, his muscles aching with a fatigue that went down to the marrow. He found Annie sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of butcher paper and a charcoal stick. "What are you drawing?" "Annie?" he asked, his voice rasping from the dry wind. Annie looked up, her dark eyes solemn. She pushed the paper toward him. It was a crude drawing, shaky and simple. It showed a house with the smoke curling from the chimney. Above it, a yellow sun the size of a wagon wheel beamed down, and standing in front of the house was a figure with long hair and a dress, holding hands with a smaller figure. "Is that you?" Caleb asked, pointing to the small figure. Annie nodded. "And that is Aunt Josie. She is coming back when the sun comes out." Caleb felt a sensation like a fist closing around his heart. He looked at the drawing, at the child's desperate, magical thinking. "Annie," he started, sinking onto the bench opposite her. "We talked about this. Aunt Josie had to go." "Because of the bad men?" Annie whispered. "Yes, because of the bad men. But the snow is gone," Annie said, pointing to the paper. "The bad men go away when the sun comes out." Caleb rubbed a hand over his face, smearing dirt across his forehead. He didn't have the heart to tell her that the sun only made the bad men easier to see. The bad men did not wait for summer. 2 days later, a buggy splashed through the mud of the ranch yard. It was Judge Ellsworth. He did not come alone. He was accompanied by a clerk who carried a thick leather satchel. The judge stepped onto the porch, picking his way distastefully through the muck, his boots polished to a shine that seemed obscene out here on the range. Caleb met him at the door. He didn't invite him in. "Judge," Caleb said, blocking the threshold. "Caleb," the judge said, his voice smooth and cold. "I have papers for you." The clerk stepped forward and thrust a document into Caleb's chest. Caleb took it, his hand stained with grease from the wagon axle he had been repairing. "What is this?" Caleb asked. "Notification of a hearing." The judge said, "Set for 3 days from now. We are revisiting the guardianship of Annie Thorne." "Revisiting," Caleb repeated. "We settled this. I am her uncle. I have a home. I have a wife." "Do you?" the judge asked. He raised a gray eyebrow. Caleb went still. "Word in town is that your wife has abandoned her post," the judge said, a thin, triumphant smile touching his lips. "It seems she has taken up residence at the Nugget, a fine establishment for minors, but hardly the address of a respectable woman. She is visiting." Caleb lied, the words tasting like ash. "Come now." "Caleb, the whole town knows she ran off, and given the stories circulating about her history, card cheats, saloons, debts, it paints a very disturbing picture of the judgment used in this household." The judge stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You brought a woman of ill repute into that child's life, and then you couldn't even keep her. It is unstable. Caleb, dangerous. I cannot in good conscience leave a mixed-race child in a chaotic environment. The state has a duty to civilize her." Caleb crumpled the papers in his fist. Fury simmered beneath his skin, hot and dangerous. He wanted to strike the man. He wanted to throw him off the porch. "Annie stays here," Caleb growled. "This is her land. It is your land. For now, the judge said, glancing out at the pastures, though I hear your mortgage is coming due, and with the legal fees you are about to incur, well, some battles aren't meant to be won. Son, he tipped his hat. We will see you in court, 9 o'clock. Bring the girl. Caleb watched the buggy rattle away. He stood on the porch for a long time, the wind tearing at his clothes, realizing that his sacrifice, letting Josie go, had not saved anything. It had only given them a bigger hammer to break him with. In Larkspur, the thaw had turned Main Street into a river of sludge. Josie Hart sat by the small window of her room at the Nugget, staring out at the grim tableau. Her hands were raw and red from lye soap. Her back ached from scrubbing floors. But it was the constant vigilance that wore her down. She lived in a state of siege, barricading her door at night, keeping her eyes down when she walked the halls. She saw the changes in town from her vantage point. She saw Silas McGraw's men swaggering in and out of the saloon across the street as if they owned the pavement. She saw the judge's carriage parked outside the bank, and she saw him tipping back whiskey with McGraw in the back office of the hotel when she went to deliver laundry. The town was turning against Caleb. She could hear it in the murmurs of the men she served porridge to in the mornings. Thorn is done, one drift rider said. McGraw cut his water access at the South Creek, and the law is coming for the girl, another added. Heard the judge say Caleb's days are numbered. Josie kept her head down, pouring coffee, but her heart hammered against her ribs. She had left to stop this. She had walked away to remove the target, but the target had just shifted. That evening, the Nugget was crowded. The owner asked Josie to help clear glasses in the back gaming room, a smoky, low-ceilinged den where high-stakes poker was played away from the prying eyes of the street. Josie moved through the shadows, collecting empty tumblers. She kept her face hidden by the brim of a bonnet she wore even indoors. She froze when she heard a familiar voice. It was smooth, oily, and terrifying. It is a lock, Mr. McGraw. A complete lock. Josie pressed herself into the alcove near the supply closet. Through a gap in the curtain, she saw a round table. Silas McGraw sat there, smoking a cigar. Beside him was the judge, and opposite them sat Mr. Vance, the debt collector. Are you sure she won't testify? McGraw asked, swirling his drink. Vance laughed. She is terrified. I have her convinced she owes $5,000. She is hiding in this very building, scrubbing floors like a rat. She won't show her face. And if she does, the judge asked. Then I destroy her, Vance said. I take the stand. I tell the court she was the mastermind behind her husband's cons. I paint her as a whore who tricked Caleb into marriage to hide from the law. I say Caleb knew all about it, that he is complicit in harboring a criminal. The judge smiled. That would seal it. We prove Caleb is morally bankrupt. We take the girl, we place her with the church for a month, then transfer guardianship to your family. Silas. And the ranch? McGraw asked. Without the girl and with the legal fines, he will be forced to sell by autumn. The judge said. Vance leaned forward. She is your ace in the hole. Gentlemen, her silence is the weapon that kills him. If she stays quiet, you win. If she speaks, we twist it until she wishes she was dead. Either way, Thorn loses. Josie felt the blood drain from her face. She felt sick, a physical lurch in her stomach that nearly sent the tray of glasses crashing to the floor. She had been so stupid. She had thought leaving was noble. She had thought silence was safety. But her silence was exactly what they were counting on. By running away. She hadn't protected Caleb. She had handed his enemies the knife to cut his throat. She backed away slowly, slipping out of the room before anyone saw her. She ran up the back stairs to her room. She paced the small space. 4 steps one way, 4 steps back. If she didn't speak, Caleb lost Annie. He lost the ranch. If she did speak, she would have to stand in front of the whole town. She would have to admit to the near prostitution, the running, the shame. Vance would tear her apart. They would call her every name she had spent her life trying to outrun. She stopped at the window. She looked out at the dark rim of the hills. Somewhere out there, 20 miles away, was a house where a little girl was drawing pictures of the sun. Somewhere out there was a man who had wrapped her in his coat when she was freezing. Caleb had fought for her. He had stood on that porch with a shotgun and told the world she was his family. Josie looked at her reflection in the dark glass. She saw a woman who had spent her whole life running, hiding, and pretending. She was tired of running. She went to the washstand and splashed cold water on her face. She took the pins out of her hair and redid the braid, pulling it tight. She put on her best dress, the blue one she had worn on her wedding day. Now cleaned and pressed, she wasn't going to run. She was going back. At the ranch, the fire in the hearth had died down to sullen red embers. Caleb sat in the leather armchair, staring at the coals. The house felt vast and empty. The wind rattled the loose shutter, the one he had fixed the night he kissed her, and the sound was a ghost haunting him. In his hand, he held the letter. The paper was worn soft from being folded and unfolded 100 times. I wish we weren't just two lonely bodies in the dark. He traced the words with his thumb. He had let her go. He had told himself it was to protect her, but deep down, he knew the truth. He had let her go because he was a coward. He could face a stampede. He could face a man with a gun. But he couldn't face the possibility of loving her and having her ripped away by a cruel world. So he had ripped her away himself. And in doing so, he had ensured that the world would take everything else, too. He closed his eyes. He missed the smell of her soap. He missed the sound of her humming in the kitchen. He missed the way she looked at him, like he was a man worth saving. Tomorrow was the hearing. He would go. He would fight. But he felt like a man marching to a gallows he had built with his own hands. The morning of the hearing dawned with a hard, pale blue sky. The wind was relentless, kicking up dust that scoured the paint off buildings. Josie didn't have a horse. She went to the livery stable before the sun was up. The old hostler, who remembered Caleb giving her that silver dollar, looked at her with surprise. "I need a horse," she said. "I can't pay you yet. But Caleb will." The hostler looked at her set jaw. He nodded and saddled a roan mare. The ride to the ranch was brutal. The wind battered her, tearing at her clothes and stinging her face with grit. The mud sucked at the horse's hooves. But Josie sat straight in the saddle. When the ranch house came into view, standing alone against the wide sky, her chest tightened so hard she couldn't breathe. She half expected to see the gate locked. She half expected Caleb to turn her away. She rode into the yard just as Caleb was leading the wagon out of the barn. Annie was sitting on the bench, wearing her gray coat, looking small and terrified. Caleb froze. He held the horses' heads, staring at Josie. For a moment, the land seemed to hold its breath. The wind died down. The only sound was the jingle of the harness. Josie pulled the mare up. She was muddy. Her hair was windblown, and she looked exhausted. But her eyes were clear. "Caleb," she said. Caleb stared at her. He looked older than he had a week ago. There were new lines around his mouth, and his eyes were hollow. "Josie," he breathed. "What are you doing here?" "I came back," she said. She slid down from the saddle. Her legs were shaking, but she walked toward him. "You shouldn't be here," Caleb said, his voice rough. "The judge, Vance, I know, she cut him off. I know everything." She stopped in front of him. "I heard them. Caleb, in town. Vance and the judge. They are planning to use my silence against you. They are going to say you were part of the cons. They are going to say you are hiding a criminal." Caleb's face hardened. "I can handle them." "No, you can't," Josie said fiercely. "Not this time. They have built a trap, and you are walking right into it." She took a breath. "I am going to testify." Caleb looked at her, stunned. "You can't. Vance will destroy you." "He will tell them everything." "Let him," Josie said. "I will tell them first. I will tell them the truth. All of it." "No," Caleb said, shaking his head. "I won't let you do that. I won't let you drag your name through the mud for me. My name is already mud." "Caleb," she shouted. "They are already whispering. If I hide, the whispers become truth. If I stand up, at least it is my truth." She reached out and took his hand. His skin was cold. "You said we were pretending," she whispered. But pretending that I never existed was your mistake, not mine. I am your wife. Maybe not in the way you wanted, but in the way that matters. I am here, and I am not leaving you to fight this alone." Caleb looked down at her hand, gripping his. He looked at her face, fierce, terrified, and loving. He felt the ice around his heart crack. He squeezed her hand back. Hard. "Get in the wagon," he said. "We are going to be late." The Larkspur Courthouse was a small, stifling box of a room. It was packed to the rafters. Ranchers, townsfolk, and McGraw's hired men filled the benches. Sweating in the close heat, the air smelled of unwashed wool, tobacco, and anticipation. When Caleb walked in with Josie and Annie, a murmur rippled through the room. It sounded like a hive of angry bees. People pointed, women whispered behind their hands. Josie kept her chin high. She walked down the center aisle, feeling the weight of every stare pressing on her skin. She sat on the bench beside Caleb. Annie sat between them, grabbing Josie's hand and holding on for dear life. Judge Ellsworth sat behind the high desk. He looked down at them, his eyes widening slightly when he saw Josie. He exchanged a quick, dark glance with Silas McGraw, who sat in the front row. The hearing began. It was brutal from the start. McGraw's lawyer painted a picture of the Thorne Ranch as a failing enterprise run by a violent man. He brought up the boundary disputes. He brought up the mortgage. And then he called Mr. Vance. Vance walked to the stand with the confidence of a predator. He was sworn in. "Mr. Vance," the lawyer asked, "you are acquainted with the woman known as Josie Thorne?" "I am," Vance said, looking directly at Josie with a smirk. "I knew her as Josie Hart, in Kansas City." "And what was her profession?" Vance paused for effect. "She was a professional lure," he said clearly. "She worked with her husband, a notorious card sharp. Her job was to distract men, to entice them into games they couldn't win. She frequented saloons. She was, well, let us say her morals were flexible for the right price." A gasp went through the room. Mrs. Miller, in the second row, clutched her pearls. And did Mr. Thorne know of this past? He must have. Vance lied smoothly. He married her days after she arrived. It was clearly an arrangement, a cover. He provided a hideout. She provided services. The room erupted in whispers. Services, hideout, whore. Josie sat frozen. Her vision blurred. She felt the memories flooding back. The grabby hands, the smell of stale beer, the jeers. She felt dirty. She felt small. Then she felt a hand on the bench behind her back. It wasn't touching her. It was just there. A solid, warm presence. Caleb's hand, steadying her, guarding her back. She took a breath. When the lawyer finished, Caleb's lawyer, a young, nervous man, looked at Josie. "Mrs. Thorne?" he asked. "Do you wish to speak?" Josie stood up. Her legs were shaking so bad she had to grab the railing of the witness box to keep from falling. The wood floor creaked under her feet. She looked at the judge. She looked at Vance. She looked at the town that had rejected her. Then she looked at Annie, who was watching her with wide, trusting eyes. Josie cleared her throat. "Mr. Vance is telling you half a story," she said. Her voice trembled, but it was clear. She turned to the room. "Yes," she said, "my husband was a gambler. Yes, I was in those saloons. But I was not a partner. I was a prisoner." The room quieted. She told them everything. She didn't spare herself. She told them about the bruises hidden under long sleeves. She told them about the night Silas tried to sell her to clear his debt. She told them about running away in the rain, about the hunger that gnawed at her belly for days, about the humiliation of asking for work and being treated like a disease. "I came to Larkspur to survive," she said, tears streaming down her face now. "I asked Mr. Thorne for work. He offered me a marriage because he needed to protect his niece. He didn't know my past. He only knew I needed saving, and he needed a mother for this child." She looked at Caleb. "It started as survival," she said softly. "It started as pretend, but you don't pretend to bake bread in a freezing kitchen. You don't pretend to sit up all night when a child has a fever. You don't pretend to stand by a man when a blizzard is trying to kill him. She looked back at the judge. I have made mistakes. I carry shame. But I am not a criminal. And Caleb Thorne is a good man. He is a hard man. Yes, but he would burn this whole world down before he let harm come to that little girl. She wiped her face. If my presence here hurts Annie, if my past is too much for this town to forgive, then I will leave. I will walk out that door right now. But do not punish a good man and an innocent child because I was unfortunate enough to survive a bad life. She stopped. The silence in the room was absolute. It wasn't the silence of judgment anymore. It was the silence of people who had just seen a soul laid bare. Even Mrs. Miller looked down at her hands. Josie stepped down from the stand. She walked back to the bench. She sat down, trembling violently. Annie buried her face in Josie's skirt. Then Caleb stood up. He didn't go to the witness stand. He just stood by the bench, towering over the room. He looked at the judge. "She told you the truth," Caleb said. His voice was deep, filling the space, but she left out one part. He looked at the crowd. I used her past. He admitted, I used it as an excuse to keep her at arm's length. I told myself she was broken so I wouldn't have to care about her. Because I was afraid. He looked at Josie. I was afraid of desire. He said, I was afraid of loss. I was cruel to her because I was terrified of how much I needed her. That is my sin. Not hers. She is the bravest person I know. And she is my wife. The balance in the room shifted. You could feel it. The shame had been lanced. The truth was out. And it was cleaner than the lies Vance had spun. The judge looked uncomfortable. He shuffled his papers. He looked at McGraw, whose face had gone sour. Well, the judge muttered, that is quite a statement. However, the legal question of stability remains. The doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a crash. Everyone jumped. A ranch hand stood there, chest heaving, covered in soot. Fire! He screamed. Range fire! It started at the south boundary. The wind is driving it straight for the Thorne Ranch. Pandemonium erupted. Caleb turned to Josie, his eyes wide. Annie, he said, Josie grabbed the child. We have to go, Caleb shouted. The hearing was forgotten. The gossip was forgotten. The only thing that mattered now was the orange glow growing on the horizon, coming to consume everything they had just fought to save. The shouts from the back of the courtroom shattered the stifling atmosphere like a hammer striking glass. Before the ranch hand could even finish screaming about the fire, the room was already in motion. The heavy oak doors banged open against the walls, and the smell drifted in instantly. Acrid, biting, and unmistakable. It was the scent of dry grass dying in a sudden, violent heat. Chaos erupted. The ranchers in the room, men who knew exactly what a wind-driven fire meant on the open range, scrambled over the benches, boots thudding on the floorboards. Judge Ellsworth banged his gavel, the sharp cracks lost in the din of shouting voices and overturning chairs. He shouted that the hearing was adjourned, that they would resume when order was restored. But his voice was thin and powerless. Everyone in that room knew the law had just been suspended. The only law that mattered now was survival. Caleb moved before Josie could even process the terror on the messenger's face. He grabbed Annie, lifting her into his arms, and seized Josie's wrist with his free hand. Move, he commanded, his voice cutting through the noise. They pushed through the crowd, spilling out onto the wooden boardwalk. The sight that met them stopped Josie in her tracks. The horizon to the south, usually a clean line of blue and brown, was stained with a dark, bruising smear. It wasn't just smoke, it was a living thing, churning and billowing into the hard spring sky, blotting out the sun. The wind, which had been annoying all morning, now felt like a curse, driving that darkness straight toward the Thorne Ranch. Get to the wagon, Caleb yelled over the rising wind. He threw Annie onto the bench seat and helped Josie up, his grip bruising in its intensity. He didn't bother with the steps. He vaulted into the driver's seat and slapped the reins hard against the horses' rumps. The team, already spooked by the smell of smoke, surged forward, nearly unseating them. The ride out of Larkspur was a blur of terrified speed. The wagon bounced violently over the ruts, the iron wheels screaming in protest. Other wagons and riders were scattering in every direction, some heading to fight the blaze, others racing to save their own homesteads. As they left the town behind, the scale of the disaster became terrifyingly clear. The air grew hotter with every mile, a dry, oven-like heat that sucked the moisture from their mouths. The smoke thickened, turning from a distant gray haze to a choking yellow fog that burned their throats and made their eyes stream. The land, which Josie had come to see as vast and open, now felt like a trap. The dry winter grass, which had just begun to show the first hints of spring green, waved frantically in the wind, looking like tinder waiting for a spark, and the sparks were coming. Small whirlwinds of ash and ember danced across the plains, carried by the gale, jumping ahead of the main fire line to start new spot fires. The sky turned a bruised orange-gray. The sun was reduced to a dull, copper coin, hanging useless and dim behind the veil of smoke. When they crested the final rise that overlooked the Thorn Valley, fear clamped around Josie's heart like a vice. The fire front was a wall of flickering orange, stretching across the southern pasture. It was eating the land with a voracious, crackling roar that they could hear even over the wind. Fence posts exploded into flame as the heat wave hit them. Cattle were running in a blind panic, a dark, shifting mass moving away from the glow, and in the distance, small and white and terrifyingly vulnerable, stood the ranch house. Caleb pulled the horses to a sliding halt near the north ridge. He turned to Josie, his face streaked with sweat and soot. "Take the wagon," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Take Annie and head for the river. The water is low, but the mud is wide. Get in the water and stay there." "No!" Josie cried, grabbing his arm. "I am not leaving you. I need to cut a line." Caleb roared back. "The hands are down there trying to turn the herd. If we don't turn it, the house is gone. Go! I can help. You have to save Annie." Annie was sobbing, a high, thin sound of pure terror, clutching her doll and burying her face in Josie's ribs. Josie looked at the child, then at the wall of fire, then at Caleb's desperate eyes. She realized he couldn't fight the fire if he was terrified for them. "Go!" Caleb yelled, shoving the reins into her hands. Josie scrambled into the driver's seat. She looked at him one last time, searing the image of his face into her mind. Then snapped the reins. She turned the wagon toward the river bottom, the horses plunging down the slope. She didn't look back. She drove with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed, guiding the terrified team toward the line of cottonwoods that marked the creek. The heat licked at their backs, a physical weight. When they reached the water's edge, Josie hauled on the brake. She grabbed Annie and jumped down. The creek was swollen with snowmelt, churning brown and cold. "Come on, baby," Josie gasped, dragging the girl toward the water. She grabbed the wool blankets from the back of the wagon and dunked them into the freezing current. She wrapped a soaking wet blanket around Annie and another around herself. "Into the water," Josie ordered. They waded in. The cold was a shock against the heat of the air, numbing Josie's legs instantly. They crouched in the shallows, the water swirling around their waists. From the river. Josie watched the ridge. It was like watching a scene from hell. The smoke clawed at her lungs, making her cough until she gagged. Through the haze, she could see small, dark figures moving desperately against the backdrop of the flames. Up on the ridge, Caleb was fighting a war. He and Gus and the other hands were mounted, dragging wet burlap sacks and using shovels to beat at the flames, trying to steer the fire away from the main buildings. They were digging a fire break, frantic energy fueled by adrenaline. "Turn the herd," Caleb screamed, waving his hat at the lead steer. "Hya!" The cattle were confused, blinded by smoke. They milled and bellowed. Suddenly, a burning branch from a cottonwood tree, carried by the wind, crashed down right in front of Caleb's horse. The big black gelding screamed and reared violently, twisting in the air. Caleb was thrown. He hit the hard-packed earth with a sickening thud. The impact drove the air from his lungs. Pain exploded along his right side, a sharp, white-hot agony that told him his ribs were broken. He lay there for a second, gasping, the sky spinning above him. The fire roared closer, the heat searing his face. "Get up," he told himself. "Get up or you die." He forced himself to his knees, clutching his side. He tried to stand, but the world tilted gray. From the river, Josie screamed. She had seen the horse go over. She had seen Caleb fall and not get up immediately. She looked at Annie. The girl was huddled under the wet blanket, eyes shut tight, praying. Gus, the foreman, had just ridden down to the water to soak more sacks. "Gus!" Josie screamed, wading toward him. "Watch her." She didn't wait for an answer. She shoved Annie toward the surprised foreman. "Stay with Gus. Annie!" "I have to get Caleb." Josie scrambled up the muddy bank. She didn't have a horse. She had left the wagon team tied in the willows. She spotted a ranch horse that had thrown its rider and was dancing near the trees. She ran to it, grabbing the trailing reins. She swung into the saddle, hiking her skirts up. The horse balked, smelling the smoke, but Josie kicked it hard. "Go!" she screamed. She rode back toward the flames. The heat was like an open oven door, singing her eyebrows and drying her eyes instantly. She ignored the shouts of the other hands. She rode straight for the spot where she'd seen Caleb fall. She found him staggering near the barn. He was on his feet, but he was swaying. He was trying to push a heavy buckboard wagon that was parked near the side of the barn. "Caleb!" she shrieked, sliding from the horse. Caleb turned. His face was a mask of soot and blood. "The kerosene," he rasped, pointing at the wagon. "It is loaded with barrels for the lamps. If the barn goes—" He didn't have to finish. If the barn ignited and that wagon was next to it, the explosion would level the house. Josie didn't ask questions. She ran to the back of the wagon. Caleb threw his shoulder against the wheel. "Push!" he yelled. Josie slammed her body against the wood. The wagon was heavy, the wheels mired in the soft earth. The heat from the approaching fire was blistering. Sparks showered down around them like deadly rain. "1, 2, push!" Josie grunted, digging her boots into the ground. Caleb groaned, the sound tearing from his throat as the effort ground his broken ribs together. But he didn't stop, slowly, agonizingly. The wheels began to turn. "Keep going!" Caleb shouted. They shoved the wagon 10 feet, 20 feet, 30! Behind them! The barn roof groaned. The fire had reached it. With a sound like a thunderclap, the dry timbers gave way. The roof collapsed inward, sending a geyser of sparks and flames shooting into the sky. "Run!" Caleb grabbed Josie's hand. They scrambled away, diving behind the stone wall of the well house just as the heat wave from the collapsing barn rolled over them. It was intense enough to singe the hair on their arms, but there was no explosion. The wagon was just far enough away. The fire raged, consuming the barn, the corrals, and the fencing. But the wind shifted slightly, pushed by the heat of the collapse, and the flames licked along the side of the main house without taking hold. The wet blankets Josie had hung on the porch earlier that morning, a small, domestic act, steamed but did not burn. In the choking smoke, Caleb tried to stand and failed. He staggered, nearly falling into the dirt. Josie was there. She grabbed his arm, ducking under his shoulder to take his weight. "I have got you," she coughed, her eyes streaming tears. "I have got you, Caleb." He leaned on her, heavy and solid. For a heartbeat, amid the crackling flames and the flying sparks, the rest of the world fell away. It was just them, two battered, soot-stained souls holding each other up against a world determined to consume them. The fire burned for another hour, moving east, leaving the ranch scarred but standing. When the wind finally died down, the air was heavy with gray ash that drifted like snow. The land around them was a smoking wasteland of blackened earth and dead brush. Caleb looked at the house. It was scorched. The windows were cracked from the heat, but it was there. He looked at the blackened fields where he had broken his back for years. Then he looked at Josie. His legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees in the dirt, his head hanging low, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Josie sank down beside him, her chest heaving. She reached out and touched his face. her fingers leaving clean streaks through the soot. "We made it," she whispered. "Caleb, we made it." Caleb turned his head. His eyes were bright, feverish with an emotion he could no longer contain. He looked at her as if he was seeing her for the first time. "I should have lost everything today," he rasped. His voice broke. "The land, the house, Annie." He took a shaking breath. "But I didn't, because of you." He reached out and took her hand, gripping it so hard his knuckles were white. "My condition," he said, the words tumbling out. "It was never because you weren't worthy. Josie, it was never about your past." He looked at the smoking ruins of the barn. "I was terrified," he confessed. "I was terrified of wanting someone so much that the loss would destroy me. I thought if I kept you at a distance, if I pretended, I would be safe." He looked back at her, his eyes searching hers. "But that night at the way station, the moment I kissed you, there was no pretending left, and it scared me half to death. I pushed you away because I was a coward." Josie felt the tears finally spill over, cutting tracks through the grime on her cheeks. She squeezed his hand. "Loving you has been the hardest thing I have ever done," she admitted, her voice trembling. "It terrified me, too. I thought I was walking into another trap." She looked at the charred landscape. "But I would rather stand with you in a burned-out field than live safe and empty anywhere else. I would rather fight the fire with you than watch it from the window." Caleb made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He reached out and pulled her into his arms. He didn't hold back this time. He didn't check himself. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling the smell of smoke and sweat and life. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was fierce and shaking. It was a kiss of relief, of desperation, of a man who had looked into the abyss and been pulled back by the only person who understood him. It was a kiss that tasted of ash and salt, but underneath, it tasted like home. They held each other in the dirt, surrounded by ruin, and for the first time, the silence between them wasn't empty. It was full. In the weeks that followed, the spring rains came. They washed the ash into the soil and turned the blackened hills a deep, startling green. The rebuilding was slow, brutal work, but the atmosphere in Larkspur had shifted. The fire had been a great leveler. People had seen Josie Hart ride a horse into an inferno to save her husband. They had seen Caleb Thorne nearly kill himself to save his neighbor's cattle that had drifted onto his land during the panic. The prejudice didn't vanish overnight, but the venom was gone. When Josie walked into the mercantile to buy nails, Mrs. Miller didn't turn away. She asked, quietly, if Josie needed help with the sewing for the new bunkhouse curtains. It was a small, fragile offering, but it was enough. The legal hearing resumed 2 weeks later. The courtroom was just as crowded, but the mood was different. It was somber. Mr. Vance was called back to the stand, but he wasn't smiling this time. He was sweating. The sheriff had found the remnants of a camp near the south boundary, the point of origin for the fire. They found kerosene cans, and they found a witness, a drifter who had seen Vance and his men riding away from the spot minutes before the smoke appeared. Under pressure, facing a charge of arson and attempted murder, Vance cracked. "It wasn't my idea," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at the front row. "McGraw paid me. He paid me to start the fire. He said it would drive Thorne out. He paid me to lie about the girl." The courtroom erupted. Silas McGraw tried to stand, his face purple, but the sheriff was already moving toward him. Judge Ellsworth sat high on his bench, looking suddenly very old and very small. He looked at the angry crowd. He looked at the evidence. And he looked at Caleb and Josie, sitting together, holding hands, with Annie between them. He cleared his throat. "Given the extraordinary revelations regarding the character of the opposition," the judge said, his voice flat, "and the demonstrated commitment of the Thorne household to the welfare of the child, the court rules in favor of Caleb Thorne. Guardianship remains with the uncle." He banged the gavel. Case closed. McGraw left town that night, his reputation in tatters. The debt collector went to a cell in Cheyenne. Josie's name wasn't magically cleared of every whisper. But the whispers changed. They didn't talk about the saloon girl anymore. They talked about the woman who rode through fire. They talked about the wife who stood by her man when the whole world walked away. Summer came to the plains. The charred scars on the land were healing, covered by a blanket of wildflowers and new grass. The ranch was busy. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air as the new barn went up. Josie worked alongside Caleb and the hands. She didn't stay in the house. She rolled her sleeves up to her elbows, her arms brown from the sun, her hands calloused from fencing wire and shovel handles. She and Caleb moved through the days in a rhythm that was no longer forced. They spoke in shorthand, a look, a nod, a smile, and at night they collapsed into the big bed in the master bedroom. There were no more separate rooms. There were no more conditions. They learned the slow, everyday intimacy of marriage. It wasn't just the passion, though that was there, fierce and healing. It was the quiet touches, Caleb rubbing liniment into Josie's sore shoulders, Josie tracing the white line of the scar on his ribs. It was the whispered confessions in the dark, the sharing of burdens until they were light enough to carry. One evening in late August, the sky put on a show. It was painted in streaks of violent pink and bruised gold, casting a warm light over the recovering valley. Caleb and Josie sat on the front porch swing. Annie was inside, asleep on the rug with the dog. The air smelled of fresh rain and cured hay. Caleb stopped swinging. He took Josie's hand, looking at the plain gold band she still wore, the prop ring he had bought her months ago. "Josie," he said. She looked at him. His face was open now. The flinty hardness was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. "We did this backward," he said. Josie smiled. "We did most things backward. Caleb," he took a breath. He slid off the swing and went down on one knee on the porch planks. Josie's breath caught. "I asked you to pretend to be my wife to save a deal," Caleb said softly. "I gave you conditions. I gave you rules. I was a fool." He looked into her eyes. "I don't want a pretend wife. Josie, I don't want a contract. I want you. I want your fight. I want your heart. I want to wake up next to you every morning until I am an old man." He squeezed her hand. "Josie Hart, will you marry me? For real? No conditions, no ending, just us." Josie laughed, a sound that bubbled up through the tears stinging her eyes. "You foolish man," she whispered. "We have been married in everything but law for months." She leaned down and kissed him. "Yes," she said against his lips. "Yes." The wedding was simple. It was held in the ranch yard, under the vast, open sky. A traveling preacher stood on a crate. Neighbors from 20 miles around came, bringing food and fiddles. Annie stood beside them, wearing a dress of bright blue wool that Josie had sewn, holding a basket of wildflowers. She looked happy. She looked safe. Caleb stood in his best suit, looking at Josie as she walked out of the house. She wore a simple white dress, the lace mended and cleaned, her hair shining in the sun. When the preacher asked for the vows, Caleb didn't recite the standard lines. He looked at Josie, his voice thick with emotion. He called her his partner. He called her his heart. He promised her that no matter what the land took, he would always give her everything he had. When he called her wife, it wasn't a shield. It wasn't a bargain. It wasn't a lie. It was a vow, as solid as the mountains behind them. They danced until the moon came up, spinning on the rough planks of the new barn floor, as another season turned and the western sky stretched wide and wild above them. Caleb and Josie Thorne stood on their porch, watching the stars come out. Their love had been born in the shadows of a cold winter, tested by the tragedy of fire and prejudice, and lit by small, stubborn hopes. It stood now as a quiet apology to the broken people they once were, and a fierce promise to the family they had chosen to be. They were standing on a land that would never be gentle, a land that demanded blood and sweat for every inch, but it had finally, after everything, allowed them a home. Thank you for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the windswept plains of Wyoming, walking alongside Josie and Caleb as they fought for survival, dignity, and love. I hope their story resonated with you. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the story. Did Caleb and Josie's ending feel earned to you? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of the American frontier, where the land is hard but the spirits are harder. Thank you for your time. And until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.